thanks to everyone for joining me. And this session will be a 3.5-hour workshop with time for Q&A along the way and at the end. And the title is Getting Started with Combine in SwiftUI and iOS. We will be taking a close look at SwiftUI, Combine, the benefits, and then jumping right into some hands-on code, and we'll build an app up from scratch. Before we do get started, just a little bit about me, why you'd want to attend a session that I have anything to say anything about. I'm iOS app architect and developer since 2010, so a little over 10 years at this. I'm currently an iOS architect at Wayfair. I'm also an author. I've authored several books and video courses and articles, and I'm also an Apple certified trainer for Apple's Swift and iOS developer programs, which are probably the best kept secret. Not everyone knows they even exist. Okay, so what's in store for this workshop? As I mentioned, we're going to take a look at some of the basics and fundamental concepts of Combine. Then we'll take a look at a comparison of UIKit and traditional APIs versus SwiftUI and Combine. And we'll spend some time looking at the anatomy of a typical SwiftUI view so you can get a sense of what all the different parts are that make up a SwiftUI view. And as I mentioned, we'll then jump into starting a new project. And in this project, we'll be creating a chat application. And this chat application will allow you to chat across the local network or through Bluetooth using multipeer connectivity APIs. And I should mention that this talk was originally planned for App DevCon in Amsterdam, which was, of course, postponed. So the app would have been, I think, an ideal app to use at a conference where people are coming from all around the world. And so another feature of this would be that it also provides translation. So if you type in English and somebody's currently translating to their native language that's other than English, it'll automatically translate on the fly for you. So we'll be able to test this as we go by just running multiple simulators, and I'll be doing that as well. So the app's called Crosstalk. So then we'll finish up with some just wrap up or retro on what we worked on. And I'll leave you with some additional resources if you'd like to continue to learn more about SwiftUI and Combine. And we'll also have a couple of giveaways. All right, so to get started, as I said, we're going to be starting with a brand new project, but there are some resources like app icons and things of that nature that you can download from this short link. I'll show it up again in a little while, but if you get a chance to do that now. All right, so jumping right into it. What is Combine? Well, it's a framework for producing or performing asynchronous operations reactively and declaratively, but reactive is really the key word here. And we know that there are several different ways that you can perform asynchronous operations already in iOS. So throughout this talk and as we get into using Combine, I hope you'll see that what Combine provides is a very streamlined way to go about doing this that is consistent throughout the SDK. As I mentioned, it's reactive, but part of that means that it's also declarative versus imperative. And so declarative really means that you'll be able to write what you want to happen and spend less time in actually implementing the details of how that happens. This is more apparent with SwiftUI than it is Combine. SwiftUI is a very declarative UI framework. And as we get into that, you'll see how that differs from, say, a more imperative approach that you would take with UIKit APIs. It provides a unified approach to Combine. So Combine provides a unified approach. And what I mean by that is that throughout the entire SDK, there'll be APIs that integrate with using Combine that all follow the same patterns and use the same types of publishers and subscriber semantics and syntax. And it's a very uniform approach. And so to look at that in a more visual way, let's just say we're working with UIKit and traditional APIs, and here we have some mutable data. And in order to work with that mutable data in UIKit, you'll need to know about each of these types of frameworks and patterns, things from notifications and delegate callbacks and completion handlers, and you'll need to know how to use GCD and/or operation queues, and you may have to work with timers as well if you need to affect the time sequencing of some of the actions that you're performing. So there's a lot of different APIs, a lot of different techniques and patterns that you have to be aware of. And where Combine comes in with this is we have, first of all, we're starting with immutable data. So this is data that will not be mutated. In fact, when Combine publishers send out a new value, or it may feel like it's a change of the existing value, but it's actually a new value. So it's an immutable data stream that flows one way unidirectionally through Combine that you can then assign and use in other parts of your app. For example, in SwiftUI, where you can bind these data streams, essentially these publishers, to your UI, and declaratively that UI will be automatically updated when the data is emitted and therefore state is changing. So Combine is, as I mentioned, integrated throughout the SDK, and there are APIs for things like URL session and notification center. You can use Combine with core data and fetch requests. And of course, it works very closely hand in glove with SwiftUI. So getting more into the specifics about what is Combine, what makes up Combine. Well, there are two chief components here. One is a publisher, and that's something that will emit values or events over time. And then we have a subscriber, and a subscriber will subscribe to receive those values or events over time. And it looks something like this, the interplay between the two, that is. And these arrows pointing down represent time. So first we have a subscriber requests to subscribe to a publisher, and that publisher will then give a subscription to the subscriber. Next, the subscriber will request values from the publisher. Now, there are a couple of built-in operators in Combine that allow you to create subscriptions. One's called sync and one's called assign to. We'll be working with them in the code shortly. But these built-in operators that allow you to create these subscriptions will automatically request an unlimited number of values. You don't actually have to explicitly specify that you want to request unlimited. It happens automatically in the implementation of those operators. So when you want to not receive an unlimited number of values, you can create a custom subscriber. And in that implementation, you can specify, say you only want to receive a max of up to 3 values, meaning that once that publisher has emitted 3 values, you won't receive any more values from that publisher. This is something called demand, and the process of managing that demand is called back pressure management. And that's a feature of Combine that can be quite useful, but it's usually an edge case type of scenario. When you need it, it's there. We won't be getting into back pressure management today, but it's good to know that that's a possibility if you need it. So now that the subscriber has received the subscription and requested values, the publisher can now send values to the subscriber. It's also important to note that the publisher will not send any values if there are no subscribers. So you have to have at least one subscriber for a publisher to send values. When a publisher is done sending values, it can send a completion event. And what that will mean is that the publisher will no longer send any more values. In fact, it can't. Once it sends a completion event, it's done. There are two types of completion events. The first one is just a normal finished event. It's just saying, I'm done, everything's fine, I'm not going to be sending any more values to you. Subscriber knows that. However, a publisher can also have an error occur. And when it does, it can emit a completion event that contains an error. And that will tell the subscriber, here's the error that I encountered. You can handle it, but I also will not be sending any more events. The publisher is essentially terminated anymore, and no more values can be sent on that publisher. Another way that this whole subscription chain can be broken, though, is that a subscriber can cancel its subscription. If you were to save a subscription to a property and persist that property and then call cancel on it, that would be sort of a subscription token, if you will, then that would cancel the subscription. More often than not, though, you'll add your subscriptions to a special collection called an any cancelable collection. And then when that collection is about to go out of scope, so dinit, for example, then the collection will automatically have cancel called on each of the tokens in its contents. So they'll cancel those subscriptions for you. And it's really important to do this because if you don't, you'll be leaking memory. So we'll be doing this over and over again in our code today, and hopefully by the end it becomes a good habit. So in between the publisher and the subscriber, you'll often have one or more operators. And these are simple methods essentially, but they're operators that work just like publishers, and in fact they are publishers. They will receive a value from an upstream publisher, perform some operation on it, and then emit the value, the modified value, downstream to the next operator or ultimately to the subscriber. And to see what that looks like in a basic example, we'll take a look at a marble diagram. That's what this is called. And now we're looking at time from left to right with the publisher on top and the subscriber on the bottom. And the vertical bar on the far right there is just a finished event saying this publisher is done. It will not send any more values at that point in time. So in between the publisher and the subscriber, we'll add a map operator. And this works just like the map operator from the Swift standard library. This one here is going to receive an integer, multiply it by 2, and emit the changed value downstream. So if the publisher would emit a 1, mapper would receive that value, perform its operation, and emit a 2 downstream. 2 would emit a 4, and 3 would emit a 6. Pretty straightforward. All right, switching gears. So now we're going to take a look at just a comparison of the workload and the types of things that you have to do when you're working with UIKit and traditional APIs, and then we'll compare that to what that looks like using SwiftUI and Combine. So typically, when you, for example, want to fetch data from the internet, decode it into your model objects, and then update the UI when those models change, the first thing you would do is you'd fetch that data, and this t-shirt just represents that unit of work. Then you would decode that data. Then you would update your states, right, your data models, and then you would update the UI. So we add up those 4 shirts, it would be something like this. With Combine in SwiftUI, you don't manually update the UI. You'll be binding your publishers that you observe on your Combine publishers to your UI, and when that state changes, the UI will automatically be re-rendered. So you don't actually need to manually update the UI. So it's not only less work, but it also eliminates the possibility of some of those edge case bugs that you can experience when you might have, for example, missed updating a label that needed to be updated when some state changed just because you added that label, say, after the initial implementation and didn't realize that it needed to also be updated when that state changed. So there are a lot of edge case UI and UX bugs that can be completely avoided by using SwiftUI and Combine as well. So we just, adding up those 3 shirts adds up to this size t-shirt, which is less than the UIKit and traditional. So less effort, better outcome. To look at this in a more practical example, here on the right, we have a product card. It's this 8-foot gnome that you can actually buy at wayfair.com where I work. It's actually 8.5 foot, but whatever. And currently it's out of stock. So we have a quantity of 0, and we have this out of stock label that's including the buy now button. And we have our data model on the left just showing that we have this product, but the quantity is currently 0. So if we go through the same steps that we outlined in the last slide, we'd be fetching, decoding, and updating that state. So now we have a quantity of 1. And the next thing we'd need to do when using UIKit and traditional APIs is update that UI. So here we go. And if we did forget to update, say, the label that indicates that it's out of stock, to hide that or remove it from the super view, then we'd have a UI bug here. The quantity got updated, but the label's still there and the gnome still can't be bought. And that makes them kind of sad. All right, with Combine and SwiftUI, and I'll just run this animation here in a moment, we'll fetch, decode, state will be updated, and the UI will automatically be re-rendered because that state changed and it's declarative. So that UI is bound to the publisher that updates that data model. So it just happens as you would expect. Buy now is now available, and the gnome is a happier gnome, as long as you buy him. He's expensive. Okay. Next, we're going to take a look at a typical SwiftUI view, and we'll sort of go from the top down and just look at the anatomy, each of the components that makes up the SwiftUI view. The first is that when you create a new SwiftUI view using the new file wizard, or you create a new project and choose SwiftUI, you'll have this content view, and it's going to be a value type. It's going to be a struct. You actually can make this a final class. It can't be subclassable. I haven't personally found a reason why we would want to make it a class. And so struct is the general type that you'll use to create your SwiftUI views. What makes a view a SwiftUI view is that it adopts and conforms to this view protocol. And the view protocol just requires a body property. And this property is a computed property that will be accessed every time some observable state changes so that the body can be re-rendered. And that's how this works. So that body is a sum view, and that sum is just an opaque type. It's basically the opposite of a typical generic placeholder. So what's happening here is that the sum view is saying the implementation will determine what the actual underlying type is, but it will be something that conforms to the view protocol. So at the top here, inside of the definition of the content view, we have a couple of properties with property wrappers. And these property wrappers, in particular, observed object and state, allow us to manage observable state for this SwiftUI view. And what will happen is when these elements are changed, when they emit a new value, this body property will be called, and we will have the opportunity for that to be re-rendered. And that's an example that I showed you before with the product card. That would be causing that out of stock view to disappear, or be removed from the view, and also updating the quantity and all the other things. These would all be bound to this particular observable object here if this were for a product card, and those would be updated automatically. So to take that, for example, in this code, we have this show settings, which is a state property that we can observe, and it's set to false by default. When that button is tapped, that we see here halfway down the code, that will automatically toggle show settings from false to true. That in turn will, with the state having changed to true, this sheet that we see at the bottom here, which has an is presented parameter, will now be true, which will then cause the settings view to be displayed. And notice that this is presented, it's declarative versus imperative. If you were using UIKit, you would have a present method, right? Present action sheet or alert controller or whatever. Okay, so now we get into the body of the body property. And the first thing we have is this navigation view. This is how you create a navigation hierarchy in SwiftUI. So this will create your navigation controller and your navigation bar, and you now have this ability to perform those types of segues to details and these types of things. Inside the navigation view, we start off with a VStack, and this is basically a UI stack view that with a vertical orientation that will allow us to start laying out our UI. So inside of that, we have a search bar. Now, this is actually a custom SwiftUI view that wraps a regular UI search bar. And we'll be working, actually we won't be working with that in this project, but if you happen to attend the previous session, we used this. And this was just a custom view that I created. And there are APIs with SwiftUI that allow you to wrap a UI view or a view controller. And you can also present SwiftUI views in a UIKit-based type, like a UI view controller. So this is an example of creating a custom view that wraps a UI view. Next, we have this list. And this list is how you create a table view in SwiftUI. So you know how we would do that normally, either in code or if you're using storyboards. And it's quite a bit more effort to set that up. But with SwiftUI, you just actually use this list function builder to start to create that table view. And then inside of it, you'll have this for each constructor that you pass it a collection, and it will now vend views on demand from that collection. And when that collection changes, it'll vend the new set of views for that collection, however many objects are in that collection. So in this example, we have this gists collection coming from our view model, and it vends that gist as an argument of the trailing closure for this for each constructor. And now we can work with that in the body of it. So the first thing we're going to do is create this navigation link, which is how you trigger a segue. So this would allow us to create, for example, the row in a table view. When you tap it, this will allow you to segue to a detail view. And in this case, we're segueing to a Safari view, which happens to be a SwiftUI view that wraps a SF Safari view controller. Below that, we have some view modifiers. And these view modifiers are attached to the views to modify them, go figure. And what ends up happening is they receive the view from the upstream, essentially, view that they're attached to. They modify that view in some way, and then they send the modified view downstream to, in this case, another view modifier. And ultimately, they return the last modification on that view. So they kind of do work like combined publishers in that sense. These are also view modifiers that we see throughout the rest of this code here. They're circled now. And so we're doing things like setting the navigation bar title or setting a foreground color, ignoring safe area insets on the bottom. And even the sheet itself is a view modifier that indicates whether that sheet should be presented or not based on that state that we're observing. And I also want to point out that you'll notice that show settings has a $sign here. And what's happening is when we want to work with this observable property as an observable property and not just regular property in regular data or regular state, we would prepend it with this $sign, and that will allow us to subscribe to it, bind to it, and these types of things. We'll be working with this a lot in code, and you'll see how you can just type the $sign when you're getting ready to create a subscription to an observable publisher like that. And it'll give you the available, code completion will give you the available publishers that you can work with there. This is just I did post this on my social media a while ago. This is just a slide that sort of tries to encapsulate all of those different anatomy pieces that we just went over. It gets a little congested, but it might be serving as might serve as a good reference for you if you are just getting started. So feel free to take a screenshot or hit me up on my Twitter, Scott EG, and I have it posted there. All right, so we'll take just a couple minutes break, see if anybody has any questions, and then we'll jump right into building our project. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or comments or anything before we kind of move on. And here's that link again in case you need to download those resources that we'll be using. Any questions? Okay, cool. We'll just keep going then. Does anybody need to take a longer break? And feel free if you do and you need to come back, that's fine too. Okay, we'll keep going. Great. Okay. Oh, did somebody ask a question here? Let's see. Nope. Okay, great. So in the resources download, you'll see that we have this Yandex API key. We'll be using that later. And we have this icon set. So we'll be working with that when we start our project. So if you go ahead and go over to Xcode and start a new project. I'll just move this into my screen here. There we go. And we'll just do a single view app. And we'll call it Crosstalk. We don't need core data. Make sure you have SwiftUI selected. And we don't need UI tests or unit tests either. So Crosstalk. And I'll just save mine on the desktop. Great. If you have Catalina installed, you'll be able to see previews when we get into working with our SwiftUI views. But for right now, I'm just going to hide that. And I'll also hide this over here, this panel. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we're going to organize our project a little bit, and then we're also going to bring in those icons that I have for the app icon. So first thing we'll do is let's just create some folders, some groups here. And I want to point out the first one we're going to create is going to be without a folder, because if you, for example, were to stick the info P list that I'm going to put in this group into a folder that is actually created in Finder, and your project wouldn't compile. So make sure you chose for this group we're about to create to do new group without folder. And we'll just call this one supporting files. And then we'll just grab all of these bottom four things: assets, the launch screen, info P list, and the preview content folder or group, and stick them in there. Sorry about that. Okay. Next, we'll create another group, and we will call this one app. And this one is a regular group, so just group, app. And we'll stick the app delegate and the scene delegate in there. Right click on Crosstalk, create another group. We'll call that models. We haven't got anything to put in there yet. We will shortly. Create another group. Views. Another group. Oh, not new file, new group. View models. And I think that's it. Okay, so I'm just going to order these the way I prefer to look at them. So app at the top, then views, sorry, models, view models, and views. There we go. All right, so let's go into our assets folder and just delete this existing app icon placeholder. Go to our app icon set that you have in the downloaded resources and just drag it in there. And that should take care of giving us the app icon. All right. So just to give a summary of kind of what we're going to do here, and these groups kind of give it away. And these look like they created it as, interesting. If they created them as groups without folders, that's okay. We just want to make sure that the supporting files group is not with a folder in Finder. It would cause your project not to be able to compile. I'm just going to build my project to make sure everything looks good so far. That's great. Okay. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating files in each of these groups here for creating models to represent our data. We'll create a view model that we'll be using to work with that data and prepare it so that it can be bound to the SwiftUI view. And those views will go inside our views group. And I think we're going to be, one other thing we want to do here, and might as well do it while we're here, is we're going to create an extension on date formatter, just something that we'll use throughout our code. And I like to do things like this as convenience extensions. So we'll just do supporting files, new file. And we'll choose SwiftUI file and next. And we'll just call this date formatter plus. There's something we're going to be creating extensions on date formatter with it. And this is pretty straightforward, just an extension on date formatter. And it's going to be a convenience init. And this will just let us pass a date style. And this will be date formatter.style and a time style. Date formatter.timestyle, .style. There we go. And this will just do this would call through to self.init. And then of course set the date style equals date style and time style equals time style. Build to make sure that looks good. Great. All right. Next, we're going to create a couple of model objects to represent the models that we'll be using in this app. So we'll right click on models, new file. And we'll create a message type. So this is going to be a chat app. And when you type a message into the text field and hit send, this is what will be used to model that message that you're sending. So we have import foundation already, and we'll go ahead and just make this a struct message. And we'll be needing to encode and decode these messages so that we can pass them. We'll be using the multi-peer connectivity APIs for that. So we'll need to make sure that this is codable. And in order to use this in SwiftUI in particular, in the for each constructor that we saw on that slide a little while ago, we'll want to have this type be something that can be represented by some kind of unique ID. So we're going to make sure that it conforms to the identifiable protocol. So that's the first thing we'll deal with, is just to make this an ID, which is, make this a ID and just set it to a UUID. It doesn't matter what that is, it's just as long as it's unique. And then we'll go ahead and create a username, which will be of type string, a value, which will actually be the message itself, and that'll also be of type string, and a timestamp. And we're going to model that just as a string as well. Stamp. Great. So what we'll want to be doing as we're working with this, and you imagine how a chat app works, we have chat messages on the right if you wrote those messages, and from everybody else they're along the left edge, and that's sort of just a typical type of design that we see for chats. And so we'll be using this next property here called is from local user. That'll be a Boolean, and it's going to be a computed property that's going to return if the username is equal to, and we haven't implemented this, so we'll just type it out and it won't compile just yet, user.local.name. And so this is going to check to see if the user.local.name value is equal to this username. If it is, then we are working with the local user, and that'll return true for this computed property. So let's go ahead and create that model. Right click, new file. And we'll also use just a regular SwiftUI file. And this will be called user, excuse me. And this one will need to be a reference type because it's going to essentially be a singleton, and we're going to use this just to represent the local user for when during runtime. So we'll just make this class user, and we'll create a static property called local equal to this instant of this user. Then we'll create a couple of properties, one for the ID. and a var for the name. And this will be a computed property that's going to just return the UI device. All you need to change this to UI kit. So change your import foundation to UI kit. And then we're going to grab the UI device dot current dot name. So if you've named your phone, you know, Scott's iPhone, then that will be the name that is assigned. And when you're sending messages, your peers will see messages from Scott's iPhone, essentially. And then we'll just make this a private init so that we only have one singleton of this user for the local. Okay. All right. So we're going to focus on, yes.
Yeah. Could we see date format extension once more?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That is right here. There you go.
Yeah, thanks. I took the screenshot.
You're welcome. Yep. Okay. So we're going to focus on the view model to begin with. And there's going to be a good amount of work on this file to get this to the point that we want so that we can use it for this initial implementation of our chat. Let me just make sure everything builds. If we have any issues here, that should clear up. There we go. Okay. So this view model, we'll go ahead and right click on the view models group, new file. And this is just going to be a regular Swift file again. And we'll call it the chat view model. All right. So we're going to just go ahead and add, we're going to go top down on this. We're going to add the imports that we know we're going to need through this. And one of them is going to be that multi-peer connectivity framework. We're going to need Combine. And we're going to need some SwiftUI. All right. We'll make this a final class. So we won't be subclassing it, so we'll prevent that from being subclassed. That also improve with compile time performance, these types of things. Chat view model. And for the APIs we'll be using with the multi-peer connectivity, we'll need this to be a subclass of NSObject. So we'll go ahead and declare that now. And we also want this to be an observable object. And I'll talk about that for a moment. Make sure you choose observable, ABLE, not the ED, which we'll use elsewhere. Okay, so this observable object is what will allow this particular type, an instance of this type, to be observable. Imagine that. And so when we are on the SwiftUI side, we'll be using an @ObservedObject property wrapper to be able to observe this view model and have that drive the changes to update the state changes that will update the UI. What's actually happening under the hood is that this observable object will now have a will change publisher that will emit before any changes to its publishable properties. Now, that being said, you don't actually have to manually implement a subscription to will change. All this happens automatically through the observed object property wrapper that we'll be implementing later. All right, so the first thing I want to do, and I'll talk through some of the details of how this app's going to work as we go, rather than sort of spend a whole lot of time talking about it up front. We'll just sort of do it on the fly. So the first thing is this app's going to have several different app states. And those will be everything from inactive to searching for chat to connected with peers and these types of things. So we'll go ahead and implement that. We'll model that now as a nested enum type called app state. And we're going to use strings so that we can use these app states to also present labels for use throughout the app. So the first one will be, we have inactive. And that's just going to be capital inactive there. Next is searching for chat. Next will be connected to host. Followed by hosting awaiting peers. And the last one is hosting with peers. Okay, now we're also going to create a computed property here that's going to help us with just an overall understanding of whether or not we're connected. So we're just going to create a property called not connected, which is going to be more useful than is connected for our use of the app. And that'll be a bool returning if the app state dot connected to host, and I'm adding these in an array. So app state connected to host and app state hosting with peers dot contains self equals false. So this is kind of a little loopy little computer property here, but what this is basically saying is if the current app state is not connected to host or hosting with peers, then it's not connected. Hear me now, but believe me later, this is a convenience property that we'll be using throughout the app, so it's helpful. Okay, so we're going to stay inside this this class definition of the chat view model, and after this enum, we'll create a couple of static properties here. The first one is going to be a service type. And this is something we need to use with multi-peer connectivity to broadcast the name of the service that we want users to be able to join. Now, in an app where you might want to create multiple different chat rooms or these types of things, you could make this dynamic. But for our purposes, we're only going to have one service, and we're going to call it, usually uses a reverse domain name type syntax. So we're just going to call it local-crosstalk. And that's going to be our service type that we'll be broadcasting and allowing peers to join to. All right, next. Safe area insets bottom. And this is something we're going to use to manage in SwiftUI. It's not as, you don't work with updating the UI to move things based on the the state of the keyboard. So we're going to manage that ourselves using this particular value here. And so we have safe area inset bottom of type CG float. And we're just going to go ahead and reach into the UI application, shared, .windows, .first, where, there we go. And in curly braces, we're going to say where the window is the key window. I probably could wrap this to another line. I'll do that in just a moment. At the end of the parentheses following that, we'll then indicate safe area insets dot bottom. And we'll use a nil coalescing operator to return 0. So let me wrap this here. There we go. Usually wrap like that. There we go. Okay. See, so what we're doing here is we're just getting the app. Let's see. This should be actually a static var. There we go. Okay, so at any moment we can access this property and get the current safe area insets bottom inset, or if it's nil for whatever reason, because this is an optional, we'll return 0. And this will be helpful to us as we start laying out our UI later. All right, next we're going to create a series of publishers using a property wrapper called @published. And what this will do is allow us to take what would normally be just a regular property on a type like this chat view model class and make this something that we can subscribe to and bind our SwiftUI view state to, or views to that state as well. So the first thing we'll do is we'll make sure this is a private set. We don't want the call site to be able to update this. We're only allowing them to subscribe to it. And that will require us to make it a var app state. And this we'll default that to app state.inactive. So it's initially, when this is initializes, every user will be inactive to start. Next, we have published var new message text. And this will be binding to and setting the search text the text that's typed into the text field in the SwiftUI will be bound to this publisher, and we'll then be able to subscribe to it, and that will kick off when we hit send, sending that value to the current multi-peer session so that other users can receive that message. Okay. After the new message text, we'll create another publisher using @published, and we'll make that private set as well. and this will be our messages. So these will be the messages that, that are saved for when you join the chat. You'll start receiving these messages, and we'll be able to present those in a scroll view for the chat window. So messages. Does anybody have any questions? Can one of my friends join? Yep, feel free to, if you have the email, feel free to forward that. Somebody should be able to join. If they have any problems with that, let me know, and I'll see if there's anything I can do to help with that. Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, could you explain about the private set? It's new to me.
Sure. So all we're doing here is we're saying that this variable will essentially be read-only outside of the context of this type, right? So if we use the private access modifier, then you wouldn't be able to read or write to this property outside of the chat view model. So in other words, the SwiftUI view would not be able to access it. But because we want the SwiftUI view to be able to access the app state, but not to be able to change it itself, we make it a private set. So now it's saying you can access this. It's basically read only to you, but only internally of this chat view model can we set it or update it essentially.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Yep. So this messages implementation here, we have, this is going to be an array, and we're just going to start off with a single message so we can see something in the UI message, and we should automatically get our.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you explain published?
Right. So what published is doing is it's allowing us to, it's essentially making this what is normally just a regular property. So this would just be a property of type string here, this new message text. And it's allowing us to work with this as also a publisher. So we'll see when we get into implementing some more of this view model that we'll be able to subscribe to any of these publishers now because we've used the @published property wrapper that enables that capability. So this is what we use to create these observable capabilities of these values, which would otherwise just be regular properties in a normal implementation. That doesn't make 100% sense. When we start getting into working with this here momentarily, hopefully that clarifies. If it doesn't, feel free to ask a follow-up question. All right, so we're going to just say that the username for this initial message is just going to be the user.local.name, and the value will just be hello world. And the timestamp will just set to an empty string for now. Okay, so we'll use another published property wrapper with another private set. And this will be our keyboard offset. And we're going to be using this, keyboard offset, to keep track of where the frame of that keyboard is to know how much we should be adjusting our UI based on it. You've probably done this with auto layout constraints and UI kit many a time. This is the way we would do this in SwiftUI, or one way we could do this in SwiftUI. So this is going to need to be of type CG float, and we'll set it to a default of 0. All right, one more publisher for the time being, and that will be @published private set, and this will be the keyboard animation duration. And again, this is something we're going to use. This will be a double. And we'll set this to 0. This is something we're going to use so that when the keyboard is displaying or being hidden, we want our UI to have the same animation curve so it feels like it's riding along with that keyboard. And if you have ever done something like this before and you didn't match that animation duration, then you might get this where the keyboard appears and then your UI catches up, and then the keyboard disappears and then your UI starts to adjust accordingly. So this is just a polishing thing that provides for a more unified feel as the keyboard is displaying and being hidden. Okay, let's scroll down here a little bit. We have, so we're going to get into implementing some of the components that are required for the multi-peer connectivity. And the first one we're going to create is going to be a session. And this will be of type MC session. And we're going to use a we're going to use a closure to set this. So we'll say equals. This is not a computed property, so make sure you put an equals there. And then I usually just, before I forget, go ahead and add the parentheses after that, which is essentially going to execute this closure lazily the first time the session is accessed. So we'll say let session equals MC session. And this will be, we're going to use the, we're going to need peer, security, identity, and encryption preferences. So we're going to use all of those there. So the first one, the peer, will be, oh, and I didn't create it yet, did I? I don't think so. No, I have to create this peer ID property. We'll do that in just a moment. I'll write it in now and we'll come back and fill it out in a moment. For the security identity, we'll just pass nil. And for the encryption preference, we're just going to say none, .none. That's one of the options there. So we're not going to worry about encrypting. We're not, revealing any personal information in our chat, hopefully. So this is looking for an ID, a peer ID. I'm going to start implementing some of these now. The reason why I don't have them up here is I'd like to organize my properties that are publicly available at the top and then private properties following. Yes, somebody had a question? No?
Yeah, in the chat.
In the chat. The meeting ID is showing an invalid message. And is my mic volume too loud or too low?
No, it's good enough.
It is good. Okay. The meeting ID is showing an invalid message. Is that somebody trying to join, I gather?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell you what we'll do. On the first break, I'll see if I can connect with that person. If you can, Amit, if you can stay on at the beginning of our first break, let's see if we can figure out how to get that person able to join. We'll be taking a break after this initial implementation, but I don't want to stop everybody from progressing with this to try to figure that out now. It might be something easy, it might not. We'll see if we can solve it out together. Okay. So we've got our session, and so I started to say we're going to start creating some of the properties that we need, that these will be private properties. So that's why I have them sort of later in the implementation. And we'll start off with that peer ID. So we have this private. And I generally will create properties lazy if there's any initialization work to be done, so we can just sort of delay their initialization until the first time they're needed. It just helps to make an app, over time, it helps to make an app feel a little speedier. So we'll say private lazy var peer ID, and this will be an MC peer ID, and this is going to require a display name. And that, of course, is going to be the user.local.name. So that should allow this to compile this session that we just created a moment ago. So we've got this session, and now we want to set the delegate for the session to self. And we'll need to implement that protocol here in a moment. And then we'll return that session. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement that. At the very bottom of the screen, we have an MC session delegate that we'll need to implement. So let's just do that as an extension to the chat view model. And that'll be MC session delegate. Okay, now there's going to be a series of methods that we need to implement here. And rather than typing them all out, we're just going to wait a moment, and then we get this fix-it suggestion that allows us to add our protocol stubs, and voila. So now we've got those protocol stubs. So let's take care of the ones we don't really care about for this particular implementation. These are certainly things that you could go on and implement to make the app even better, so that you can add images or videos or what have you, but we won't be doing that today. So this bottom one here did receive resource with name. We're going to just delete these code placeholders out of all of them, and we're only going to be implementing the first one, I believe. Yeah, the first two maybe. Yeah, two. Okay. So the first one is when we get this session, okay, that the state did change, we're going to want to do a few things here. First, we're going to say self.session equals session. So we'll be updating the session to match every time. And then we're going to guard that our state does not equal connecting. And what's happening here is, I played around with this MC multipeer connectivity APIs, and I found that there's a lot of chatter for this connecting, and we don't really need to worry about that. So we're going to just basically guard that if the state is in a connecting status, we're going to ignore it for this particular implementation. Next, we're going to actually check to see if the state change that's coming is for the host. So in order for us to do that, we're going to need to add a property to get a handle to this, what we'll call a host ID. And we'll make that just a private var here. Host ID. Sorry, host ID. And that will be an MC peer ID, and we'll make this an optional. So it'll be nil by default. Okay. So back down in our delegate, we're going to say if the state is connecting, we're going to just bail, and we'll be implementing that return here in a moment. And then also if the host ID is equal to the peer ID. And what's happening here is we're saying, if I'm the host, then I've already done what we'll see as we implement this. I've already done the work that I need to. I don't need to respond to this state change because I'm the one that initiated it and I've already handled it. So we're also going to bail out of this method if the host is self in this case. So if peer ID does not equal self.peer ID. And what this is saying is the change is not from me. So if I'm not the host and the change is not from me, so if I'm joined multipeer, but I'm actually not the host, we want to also in the same way not handle if the change is not from me. So I'm sorry, not handle the change unless it's not from me. So that's why we're guarding that case there. And I'm going to add some comments there just so as a takeaway you have that clarification. I found myself giving thought to this over and over again and trying to make sure that I was doing that right as I was implementing this. So this is going to say I am the host and did change is not from me. Okay, otherwise we don't need to worry about processing these changes. All right, so what we're going to do after that, so now if all these conditions are met to our expectations, then we're going to use a dispatch queue.main.async, and we'll go ahead and say self, we'll make a weak capture self here, and then self.appState equals session dot connected to peers is empty. Then we'll say hosting awaiting peers, otherwise hosting with peers. So we're basically using this to update our app state based on whether or not, if I'm the host and the change was not from me, then we're saying, okay, if that's the case, then if your connected peers for the session is empty, then you're waiting for some peers to join. If there's even one peer in there, then you're hosting with peers. And so we'll be updating our UI to display that state to the user. And we'll see that when we start to run this once we get past this first implementation. So that's it for this particular method. And I might have said earlier, I might have said this incorrectly, even though this is the correct implementation. We want to be handling this if I am the host and the change is not for me, just to clarify in case I did say that the wrong way earlier. Okay, so inside of this session did receive data. So now we're receiving a message from somebody. We want to go ahead, this is going to require us to use a do catch block because we're going to be doing something that has a throwing, that can potentially throw an error. And we'll pause there for a moment because I need to implement that method. So I'm going to go up to the top here. And we will, let's see where we have this. There we go, sorry. Okay, so we'll go back to the main implementation just below these properties that we started to define. And we'll go ahead and implement a private method called insert. And this will be inserting a message of type message. And all we're going to do here is we're going to use dispatch queue.main.async. And we will make a weak capture here. Oops. And we're going to insert this into the messages array. Insert message, add 0. So this is going to insert the message at the beginning of the array. And we'll see that as we first implement this and using a scroll view in SwiftUI, the scroll views are always scrolling from the top. And so we want to make sure that that message is added to the top. So as each message is added from somebody sending a message, it's the topmost message. Later, we're going to reverse that scroll view, and then we'll be appending instead of inserting. But for right now, we're just doing as an insert at 0. So we've got that method in place. And we'll go ahead and insert. the message. And to get that message, we're going to use a try JSON decoder .decode. And we'll say that message type will be message.self. And that'll be from the data that is received in this callback method. And so if that does throw an error, we'll go ahead and catch it. And for our purposes here, we'll just go ahead and print that error. Okay. So I've been kind of going back and forth here. I'm going to just kind of go back to the top and implement the rest of my properties that I know I'm going to need, so we're not bouncing back and forth. And we've also got an initializer and some other methods that we're going to need to finish off this view model implementation. So let's just go right back to the top here. We've already created a couple private properties, and we still need a few more. And those will be, the first one we'll work on is, actually we'll go to the top here, right below the publisher. We've got our session, and now we need to create a couple of properties that we'll be using, and those will be, first one, a timestamp. So this will be what we're using for the messages timestamp, and it's going to be a string. And this is going to be a computed property that's going to use that formatter. I need to actually instantiate that formatter. Let's see here. Where is that? Here we go. So we'll just go down here and we'll create our formatter, and this will be a private property as well. And this is going to be a date formatter. And this is that extension that we created earlier with date style, and we'll just say short and time style short. So now we can use that formatter in this computed property, formatter.string from date. So this is going to just give us a nice timestamp string that we can use as a label in our messages. So whenever a new message is added, it'll show the time when that message was added to the conversation. All right. In the implementation, we're going to want to check to see if the new message text is empty. And what I mean by that is if somebody were to type in a series of spaces into the text field, we don't want that to be able to be sent as an empty message, right? We're also going to, later on, we're going to trim the leading and trailing spaces or carriage returns from the text just to keep things tidy. So for our purposes here, we want to just determine if new message text is empty. This will be a Boolean, and it's literally just going to take that new message text, trimming characters in, and we're going to say white space and new lines, dot is empty. Is empty. There we go. Right? So if somebody were to type in a series of spaces and then the send button will not allow them to send that message. We just want to allow actual messages to be sent. So that's what this convenience property is going to be doing for us. Okay. Below that, we're going to implement another property. This one is going to be our action sheet title. So what's going to happen is we'll have an action button on the chat, and when the user taps that, they'll be able to host a chat, join a chat, and as we'll see later, they'll be able to turn on and off translating. So they'll be able to translate from that action sheet. So we're going to have action sheet title. Oh, title. There we go. That'll be of type string. And this title will be a computed property based on the current app state. So we're going to switch over the app state. And case inactive will return a helpful message. Do you want to host or join a chat? Case searching for chat or connected to host. Do you want, when I return, do you want to disconnect? So just to kind of explain what's happening here, because we're doing a lot of sort of preliminary work before we get to the point of seeing something fun happen with our app. All we're doing here is we're providing some helpful methods and computing properties that will allow us to display the correct information to the user, meaningful and contextual information to the user. So if the user is searching for a chat, if they've selected they want to start searching for a chat, or for that matter, they're already connected to one, they can stop that process by selecting this particular option that we're giving a title for. And the last one will be hosting with peers hosting awaiting peers or hosting with peers. And this will be return, do you want to stop hosting? Okay. Just a few more properties and a couple more methods, and we're going to be close to done with this view model for now. So this will get us into where we can start working on UI stuff as well. Okay. So I'll keep going with these private properties here, and I'll create another one for what we're going to need. It's called an advertiser. Private lazy var advertiser. And this is going to be an MC nearby, and make sure you get this right, nearby service advisor, nearby service advisor. And this will require us to pass the peer ID, peer ID. Peer ID, there we go. Discovery info, we can pass nil. And the service type is going to be that static type that we created earlier to represent the crosstalk app service. So just self.service type. And you may know if you use a capital self here, that's the same thing as if I just typed in chat view model. It just says convenience there. Okay. Next, we're going to create a browser. And this is going to be how we browse, how users can browse to connect to a chat. So private lazy var browser. And of course, none of this is SwiftUI or Combine, but in order to create an app, we're going to be working with lots of other frameworks and APIs besides just SwiftUI and Combine. So that's what we're working on now. So MC nearby, and this will be service browser. So make sure you get browser there. Okay, peer ID. It keeps doing that. Okay. And once again, the service type will be self.service type. Great. We have our peer ID already. We need a host ID. We have a formatter. And the last thing we need here for private properties is something that I mentioned to you in the slides earlier. We need a collection called subscriptions. And this is going to be set to a set of any cancelable. And what this does, let me just empty set for now. When we create subscriptions, we'll be adding those subscriptions to the subscriptions collection here. And then when this chat view model is about to go out of scope and de-init essentially, it's about to be deallocated, that subscriptions property will call cancel on all of its contents. So those will actually all be subscriptions, and we need to do this, otherwise be leaking memory there. Okay, so we need to implement an initializer. And so we'll go right above this func here, this private func, and we'll implement our initializer. And this will actually be an override because we're working with a subclass of NSObject. So we'll call super.init. And we're going to create two subscriptions in the initializer. So when this view model is first instantiated, we're going to create subscriptions. And these are going to be so that we can get the keyboard notification, keyboard will hide and will show notifications so that we can update our UI accordingly. And so we've kind of done some of the legwork for that already, but now we're going to create the publishers that allow us to manage for that. And so Notification Center has integration with Combine, and it allow us to create a publisher from a notification. So we're going to use that now. Notification Center. So Notification Center. .default. .publisher. And this will be for UI responder .keyboard will hide. Make sure you have will hide notification. And the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to use what's called a side effect. So this is an operator called handle events, and I'll talk about it for a minute before I implement this. What handle events is going to allow us to do is to receive the value from the upstream publisher and perform some side effect potentially using that value. But a handle event operator cannot modify that value in any way. So it's going to need to pass that value through unchanged, and you would not be able to modify that value. So unlike other operators like the map one that we saw in the slides earlier, handle events is a side effect. And so our side effect that we want to perform here is we want to just set the keyboard offset to 0 whenever we get this will hide notification. So to do that, I'm going to go inside of the implementation for handle events, and I'll start typing receive, And we see that we have several different options here. And what I actually want is receive output. Okay, and we'll implement the trailing closure here. We'll create a weak capture of self. And even though we could receive the value from the upstream publisher here, we actually don't need it for anything, because all we're going to do in our side effect is set the keyboard offset to 0 whenever this will hide will occur. And so I'll just go ahead and use underscore to ignore it in self.keyboard offset equals 0. Okay. So this gets to where we're going to merge this with another publisher that I'll create in a moment here. And what we're doing here is we're going to be mapping to the user info and then updating what's the duration for that keyboard animation and setting that on that keyboard animation property that we created earlier. And again, this is polished to make the user experience feel good and have the animation duration for the keyboards displaying and hiding and our UI match to be the same durations. So that's what we're doing here. We're using a merge operator for that purpose with notification center. With notification center dot default notification center dot publisher for, and this will be the UI responder. Keyboard will show notification. Will show, not did show. And as I mentioned, then we're going to use the map operator, and that can take a key path. And you'll notice if you do the backslash and then the period, we get all the different types of values that can be accessed through this value that's being passed down through to it. And in this case, we want to just get to the user info. And we use the compact map operator. And what we're going to do here, and this is just a bit of a, I'll sort of type it out and I'll kind of try to explain it after the fact, but we're going to use the default value, which is going to be that user info object that we receive. And we want, it's optional. We want to reach into the UI responder as the key, keyboard animation duration user info key, keyboard animate key, let's see, keyboard animation duration user info key, and want that to be an NS number. So we're going to use the optional as to assign that to cast that as an NS number and get the double value for that. Double value. All right, there's a lot there, but that's basically taking the, let's see if there's something that's not right, I'll check it. Let's see. That should be good to go. I think we'll just keep going. I think that'll clear itself up. Maybe not, we'll find out. And then we'll use the assign to operator. And I mentioned earlier, there are two operators that you can use to create a subscription in Combine. One of them is this assign operator, and it's allowing us to assign to using the key path to some other property on this view model. In this case, it's going to be our publisher. And this will be to our keyboard animation duration on self. So let's see, why does that not like that? Oh, I see why. This should be a parentheses. There we go. Yep, that should take care of it. And this should be a parentheses here as well. So just to clarify that, we're just encapsulating this entire thing in a single value. So we're reaching into this user info dictionary. We're using the keyboard animation duration user info key, which is provided by UIKit, and then casting that value as an NS number. All of these things are optional, which is why we use the compact map to filter out any nils. Ultimately, if we don't have any nils, we get the double value of that value, and we're assigning that to the keyboard animation duration. Now, I want to point out here, you'll see that you're getting a warning here, and it'll tell you that the result of this call to assign to on is unused. What that means, it's not entirely helpful if you're just getting started with Combine, but what's happened is we've created a subscription here, but we haven't persisted it. We haven't kept a token to keep it around. And if we did nothing more, then as soon as you exited the scope of this initializer, the subscription memory would be leaked and the subscription would go away. So we would either need to have a property called, notification center, keyboard, publisher, something of that nature, to keep a handle to that individual subscription. And then in the dinit for this view model implementation, we could manually call cancel on that property. We're not going to do that. The typical best practice that you'll do here is you'll use the store in property and store this in the subscriptions. And so this is something you'll do at the end of every subscription typically, as opposed to just manually keeping properties around for each individual subscription. There could be some situations where you want to do that manually and individually, but this is sort of the norm. And if you've done any reactive programming before with RX Swift, this is likened to the dispose bag that you would typically add your subscriptions to in that way. So it's kind of the same thing happening here. All right, so we've completed this notification and merge of the will hide with the will show so that we can update the duration. And that's what we did, just update the duration property. We're going to create one more subscription here, also to using notification center.default.publisher. And this is going to be for the UI responder. Keyboard will change frame notification. So keyboard will change frame notification. So this is going to be how we determine how much we should be moving up our UI as the keyboard's frame changes. And so that's how we'll do that here. So we have this notification. We're going to very similarly map to the user info dictionary. And we'll use the compact map. And we're going to do the same kind of thing here, although this time I'll type it correctly. We'll go ahead and use the info dictionary using the UI responder, keyboard frame, and we want the end user, so it's this one here, keyboard frame end user info key. Once again, we want to cast this, conditionally cast this as an NS number. And we want the size, that should be, let's see, NS number. Oh, sorry. So we want to basically get that keyboard frame not as an NS number, sorry about that. That'll be CG rect because that's a size that we want to get. And then we have size dot height, right? So this is going to allow us to map into this user info dictionary, get this particular height value, and be able to use that to set our value that we'll assign to here in a moment. And that will allow us to do the proper offsetting for our view when the keyboard is displayed or hidden. So the thing that we'll want to do here is we want to map this value first, and we're going to take it, we're going to multiply it by -1, and that's because we want the opposite value. So we're going to be moving the offset up, and so the Y value will be decremented as that value increases. And then we're going to also add to that the safe area bottom inset. And what we're doing here, safe area inset bottom. I mean, I didn't define that yet. Let's see. I thought I did. No, maybe not. Okay. Maybe I just didn't type it correctly. Let's see. Static var safe area inset bottom. Oh yeah, it's right here. Safe area inset bottom, static var safe area insets. That's what happened. That's fine. So I'm just changing that property name to just be inset bottom. And that should be all set. And we're getting that same warning again. I just cleared out because I changed my text, but yeah, I was getting that same warning because we have this subscription that we haven't managed yet. And we'll do store and we'll need, I'm not sure why I'm not getting clone completion, but just make sure you have the ampersand when you're referring to those subscription, because otherwise you'd be trying to work with a copy of that and that wouldn't have the same effect. So let's just do a build and see if we have any problem with that. Build failed. Let's see. Okay, I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll take a 5-minute break here. I'm going to figure out why this isn't compiling. I've clearly missed something here. We'll come back, pick up where we left off. We'll be done with the implementation of this initial version of the app shortly. We've done a lot of the legwork already. So right now it's, well, let's say it's just almost 20 past the hour. we'll go ahead and go till 25 past the hour, and then we'll pick it right back up.
I think you just forgot to assign.
Okay, I'm back if anybody has any questions. I did see what I missed doing, which is why we're getting that compiler error. So I'll resolve that here when we resume at 25 past. But in the meanwhile, if anybody has any questions, and I just see a couple of comments, and oh yeah, somebody, Philippe indicated, right, I need to use this subscription. That's what it was. And thanks for the feedback along the way, guys. I didn't see that until now, but I appreciate it. Let's see. So first of all, the question is, MC session delegate needs our class to be NS object. Yes, I believe that is why we need to make that be a subclass of NS object. Amit, are you on the line?
Yeah, I'm on.
Okay. Did your friend, were they able to connect?
No, he wasn't.
Okay, let me see here. Did you get that message?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, if you want to give me their email address, I should be able to send the meeting invite to them from the console. Let's see here. Okay, let's see. Let's see here. Yeah, that's the link to register. Thanks. I tried forwarding that same email. I think the idea is the same. So either way, but I just forwarded it to that person's email. So hopefully that works for them. If it doesn't, I'm not really sure what else I can do. So I apologize for that. It might just be a limitation of Zoom that doesn't allow you to join after the meeting's already started. I would think that would be kind of a strange thing, but maybe. And if that doesn't work, maybe they could even try using a different email address. Maybe there's somehow their account or it's not letting that email connect for some reason. So that's about all I can think of there, Amit.
Yeah, not a problem. Let's continue with it.
Yep. Okay, so we're at 25 past, And just as some of the eagle-eyed of you out there pointed out to me, the thing that I was missing was the assignment. So I'm just going to go ahead in here and assign this to, so for all that work, I didn't do the actual assignment to, using the key path, we want to assign that to the keyboard animation duration. I'm sorry, no, the keyboard offset. On self. And that should compile. Great. All right, so let's see, what else do we have left here to do before? Oh, we have a couple more methods to implement. And we have some additional delegate methods that we want to deal with here that I'll put there in a moment. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll scroll, and we're still in the view model, and we're going to scroll down to where we created this initialization, this initializer, and we're going to put some additional methods in here that we're going to need to use to clear out messages and these types of things. So the first one, pretty simple. We'll just create a method called clear. And this is just going to set the new message text to an empty string. All right, next, we're going to have a method that'll make it easy for the call site to send a message. And so that will be, we'll guard that the new message text new message text is empty. Where did I implement that? A second here. Yes. Okay. So I did create a helper computed property here. New message text is empty, and we'll use that here. So we'll say guard new message text is empty equals false, else we'll return. So we're not going to allow the user to send a message if it's just empty text. Then we'll create a message from that new message text. And that'll be using the user.local.name. So when you're using the send method, you are the one that's sending that message. So we'll just go ahead and default that to that value. Then the message text itself is the message value. And then the timestamp will be that timestamp computed property that we created earlier. So pretty clean. Then we will insert the message into our local messages using this insert message method. And then we'll set the new message text to an empty string. All right, so that takes care of adding the message locally. So we've sent this message, we've added it to our own local messages. However, we also need to use the MC session APIs to send the message to all of our peers that are connected to the chat. And that's going to have a throwing method in there. So we'll go ahead and create a do catch block. So let data equal try JSON decoder dot encode. Oh, I said decoder. I want encoder there. Let me fix that. JSON encoder dot encode message. And then we'll use the try method here. Oh, sorry, the try operator here. Session dot send. And that'll be the data to peers session dot connected peers. And we'll use the reliable send mode. I don't know why you'd want the unreliable, but okay. Catch if we get an error and just print out the error. Okay, that should compile, great. All right, so we have 3 more methods here, and I think that actually wraps things up for us. Oh, no, we do have a couple more protocol delegates that we want to implement here, and we'll do that here in a moment. So right after the send, we'll go ahead and create a method that's going to allow us to start advertising. If we want to be a host and we want to host the chat, we need to advertise that so that peers can connect to us. So start advertising. And we'll say the advertiser delegate equals self. We'll have to implement that momentarily. Then we'll say advertiser start advertising. Oops, start advertising peer. There we go. And then we'll change the app state. So we're managing our own local value for the app state will now be to hosting with peers. Oh, sorry, hosting awaiting peers because we don't have any peers connected yet. And then we'll set the host ID equal to our peer ID. So in other words, we're saying we are the host. That's all we're doing with this start advertising. But in order for this to work, we will need to implement the protocol requirement for the advertiser delegate. So let's scroll on down to the bottom here for now, and we'll go ahead and implement that. And we'll do that as an extension on chat view model. MC nearby, these APIs get kind of long, or type names I should say, nearby service advertiser delegate. And we want advertiser did receive invitation from peer, did receive. I don't know if you're familiar with this. If you're not, if you start typing some of the characters that are part of the API, Xcode code completion does a pretty good job of finding that for you. So let's see, did receive advertiser, that's the one. Let's just make sure, did receive invitation from peer. Yep, that's the one we want. Okay, pretty lengthy implementation there. And all we want to do here is we want to say invitation handler true and pass the session back. And then change our app state equal to now we're hosting with peers. So what's happening here is that this callback is allowing us to update our state to show that we actually do have peers that have connected to us after we've been advertising. And so that's why we're using the invitation handler, passing true and then passing the session back, which sort of syncs all of this up. All right, while we're here, just to finish up this bottom portion of this implementation, I know I'm going to be creating another delegate protocol here. So we're going to implement that now. So it's going to be extension chat view model. And this one's going to be the service browser delegate. This is going to be what users use the delegate callback when you're browsing to connect to a chat. You want to join one, in other words. So this will be MC nearby service browser delegate. And this has two methods we want to implement. First one is browser found peer. And so this is when you actually, when the user that's browsing for a chat to join actually finds that chat to join. So we're going to do browser.invite peer ID to the current session. We don't have to worry about passing a context. We'll pass nil for that. And we'll just say this will allow this to try for 30 seconds before it times out. We'll now change our app state to connected to host. We're now connected to a chat, and we're going to set the host ID to the peer ID that's passed. Host ID equals the peer ID that was passed here. So in other words, we've connected to this particular peer, which is the host for the chat, and we're setting our local host ID to that value so that we know who the host is. Similarly, we're going to want to get a callback when the peer is lost. So if, for example, you're the host and you you disconnect from the chat, all of your peers are going to get kicked out, right? They're not going to have a host anymore, and the chat's going to go away. So we'll do, we'll do browser lost peer. And if the host ID equals the peer ID here, then we're going to call disconnect, and I'll implement that method here in a moment. We haven't implemented it yet. So we're going to call our method that's going to disconnect, and then we're going to set the self.host ID equal to 0. Sorry, equal to nil, not 0. Okay, that should take care of that, but we haven't implemented this disconnect method yet. So we're going to scroll back to the top here, and I think we have maybe one more method to implement, and believe it or not, we'll be done with our view model for now. So after we have start advertising. We have two more actually: start browsing and then disconnect. So let's go ahead and do the start browsing. Start browsing. And we're going to say browser.delegate equals self. That's one of the callbacks we just implemented. And then browser start browsing for peers. And then we'll change the app state equal to searching for chat, right? So when the user will tap from the action sheet to start browsing for a chat to join, this start browsing is going to be called, and it's going to update our state and call start browsing for peers using the multipeer connectivity framework. Okay, last method. And this by far is the most dense part of the implementation is this view model. It's the brains behind the operation. So that's why we're putting all this logic in here. So disconnect. And this is just going to basically nil everything out and stop the advertising and stop the browsing. And it just, kind of fire hose it and shut everything off. So stop advertising for peers, browser, stop browsing for peers, session disconnect, post ID equals nil. And what I found through trial and error really is that we want to make sure we set this app state. This will all happen in the background when this disconnect is being called. And so we just want to make sure we're on the main queue when we're updating our app state because that'll be bound to UI. And so I'm just going to use a dispatch queue.main.async here and self.appState equals inactive. And we want to make this a weak capture just to do everything by the book. And then change this to an optional here. All right, so let's just take a look at that. That completes our implementation of disconnect. And I want to just do a quick test and check on my finished product to make sure I haven't missed anything. And it looks pretty good to go. Let's do a build. Awesome. Amit, oh, I see some questions here. Let me pause for a second here. I've got a few questions here. Amit, do you know if your friend was able to join?
Yeah, he joined.
Okay, great. I'm glad that worked out. Yeah, so the first question is, what's your take on importing SwiftUI UIKit and view models? Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. I generally would not want to do that, but in some cases, especially for some of these types of demo apps, it is one less layer of abstraction to separately do that elsewhere. And so I think I did that here because we're accessing some SwiftUI APIs. But as far as just it being a hard and fast rule, I would say no. But generally speaking, I try to keep SwiftUI in the UI layer, and model objects would maybe have combined, but not necessarily need SwiftUI in a purist type sense. And you're working with the navigation link directly in the view. That means that the view knows about the next one, tight coupling, not very reusable. In SwiftUI, that navigation link is how you would go about doing that. Once again, we could extract that into a separate SwiftUI view and kind of really, break things out to try to make this, perfectly decoupled. But for purposes of just, sort of covering the ins and outs of how you get started with using SwiftUI and Combine, I'm keeping it all in there. So feel free to refactor and kind of take your ideas through to completion and actually implementing that decoupling. And if you do decide to do that, it'd be great if you'd share that with me. I'd like to take a look at it. What's your take? Oh, the question got asked twice, it looks like. So yes, the navigation link will need to be provided a destination to travel to. That's basically how you create that segue from the view that you're currently in, and then through that navigation link to the next view. How can we solve navigation in UI using coordinators UIKit? Actually, in my previous talk that I gave on Wednesday, we used coordinators for handling delegates for things like the search bars, delegate callback, and for the Safari view controllers, user did click finish callback. So I don't have an example to share with you in this particular project, but you can go on my Twitter or LinkedIn and you can see, you can download the project and you get examples of using coordinators when you're basically hosting UIKit views or view controllers, how you go about doing that. And that has two examples in there, the search bar and the Safari view, which should be good examples for you there. Any other questions? Okay, cool. All right, so let's see where we left off here. We just finished our view model and we've got everything else done except for the view. Let's do that now. Right click on views, new file. This time it will be a SwiftUI view. And we'll call this content view. Content view. You can call it whatever you want. That's what I call it here. That's the pretty typical. Oh, wait a second. Did we already create it? We might have already created it. It says we did. That's interesting.
It's at the bottom.
Ah, thank you very much. Ah, that's right. Wow, look at that. What I do without you guys. So this was actually, I never did move this into its proper home. This was created because we started by creating SwiftUI, and this is what I mentioned to you earlier. This is what you get for free when you start by selecting SwiftUI. Thank you for pointing that out. Who knows how long I would have tried to figure that out for. All right. So what we're going to do here, we're going to first import multi-peer connectivity at the top. Be using that here on the SwiftUI side. And then we'll get rid of this. Now, I'll just actually go ahead and show the canvas here now. Oh, not assistant. We want the canvas. And this will, I'll just make this a little bit smaller here. Now, you can deal with hitting resume all the time. And anytime you make any changes, it'll usually require you to manually hit resume. So the keyboard shortcut that you may want to memorize is Command-Option-P, which will also force everything to reload and resume, and that you can update your UI. So I'm going to also just shrink this down a little bit here. And of course, the preview that we're looking at is for an iPhone 11 Pro Max, I believe, is the default that we have here. We're actually going to go down to this previews here, which is, I'll explain what this is later, and we're going to update it so we can see multiple different layouts. We could see, for example, both light and dark mode, and we could actually look at, for example, this iPhone Pro 11 Pro Max and maybe an iPhone 8, just to see how our design varies. And that's kind of a neat feature within the previews capability of SwiftUI and Xcode 11. Okay, so we're at the top of this content view. We're going to get rid of this hello world for right now. And the body has to return some view. So we're going to not be able to compile until I put something else in there. But inside of the definition for the content view at the top, we're going to do we're going to use three different types of property wrappers. The first one is we're going to use this at environment. And we want to get it handled to the color scheme, because we want our app to be able to provide different displays and a nice visual appearance based on whether the device is in light or dark mode. So the environment value that we can access here is called color scheme. And we're going to assign this, using this property wrapper, we're going to assign this color scheme to a property of the same name, color scheme, and that's of type color scheme. Okay, next. So I mentioned earlier that I'll just go back to it to show you, we have this view model that we created, and this view model is an observable object, and that will then cause this to be able to vend a will change publisher for any of its published properties that will allow us to bind or observe that state change, and then bind that through SwiftUI to update our UI. And that's what we're doing now. So we're doing the other side of this equation. Observable object is how you make a reference type be observable. And now in the SwiftUI, we can go ahead and use the @observed ed object. We'll make this private. View model equals an instance of this chat view model. Later on, we're going to actually uplift this to be an environment object, and I'll use that as an opportunity to explain the difference there. But for now, we're just making an observed object. And the last piece of state is going to use the state property wrapper. And this is generally what you want to, state, there we go, @state property wrapper. You generally want to make these private as well, because these shouldn't be something that you can access externally. So if we had other views, we would be able to reach into the state of another view. The way that you would pass this state through, we're going to do later, is by using a binding property wrapper. So just keep that in mind. We'll do that in a little while. So this is going to be show action sheet, and this is going to be equal to false. So if you remember in the slide that I showed you earlier, we had, I think, show sheet or something like that, or present sheet. This is kind of going to serve a very similar purpose in this particular implementation. When this toggles to true, we will have some view modifier that will present our action sheet with the options like hosting or joining a chat or starting translation. And this is what's going to trigger presenting that. Okay, so the other thing we're just going to create is, I think I have some date strings that I want to present in here. So I'm going to create a formatter for that. That'll be that same API date formatter convenience initializer that lets us just specify the styles in line, short and short. Okay. Okay, now we're moving on to the body here, and we've got decent amount of code to write that will get through this, and then we'll be able to run this app, and we'll have our first implementation done. We'll take a 10-minute break after we finish that, come back, and we'll move on. We've got 3 other steps that we're going to take to improve this app to the point where we have a finished product. How are we doing on time here? Yeah, we're doing good. Okay. So we're inside of the body property, right? This has to return some view, and the implementation will determine what kind of view. As long as it conforms to property, as long as it conforms to view, it'll work. So navigation view. This is how we create that navigation hierarchy. And inside of there, we have our VStack. This is a vertical stack, just like a UI stack view with vertical orientation. And inside of there, we're going to create a scroll view. Now, so this is sort of this is the way you would sort of nest these things. We notice that the outermost container essentially is type. I would not be able to navigation view and then put, say, a text below this. Otherwise, we get a complaint because we're only returning some view, not an array of views, which is why we have sort of this nested type of structure here. So we have scroll view, and inside of that, we're going to create another vertical stack. And inside of that, we're going to use that for each that we saw on the slides earlier, and we're going to pass it the view models messages. And in the trailing closure for this, we will just assign a name to that argument that gets passed through, which will be in each individual message for the view models messages. And then we'll do text, and we're going to create a method here. I'm just going to put an empty string there for right now. And what we're going to do is, when we have a chat app, and I think I can just show you here for a moment. No, I don't have it loaded. That's okay. I'll show you shortly. But when we have a message, we want to display a caption that'll just show the name of the person that sent that message and a timestamp, just to, something you would typically see, say, in the Messages app, for iOS. So we're going to kind of mimic that. And so rather than putting all that code in here, right in line in this text, I'm going to create a helper method that's going to do that for us. So we'll go down below this body property here, still inside the definition of the content view, and we'll create a private func caption for message, and that'll return a string. And so we're just going to kind of do this in line with a nice ternary operator. Message is from local user, then we're going to not put anything. We don't need to have a caption for our own messages. Otherwise, we'll have a string interpolation that will have the message dot username. That should be a dat. There we go. Message dot username. Oh, I didn't actually enclose that in quotes. There we go. Message dot username, a dash. Oh, I see what I did. Okay. So what we're doing actually is we're going to show the timestamp for all messages, including message that we sent ourselves, just so we can see when we sent that message. But we're not going to include the username in the caption for our own messages. That's what happens. So we're going to basically make sure this is wrapped, and this will be inside of here, just like that, and then plus, and then we'll create another string interpolation that passes the message dot timestamp. And I think we could have actually not done the interpolation here, but I'll just leave that. That's what I'd implemented, and I know that works. Pretty sure we could do that. Let me stop for a second and see if there's any questions. How can we solve navigation? Oh, I think that was the same question that was from before. Yeah. Okay. All right, so we have this caption for, and we can use that here in a moment. While we're here, though, we're going to also implement another helper method that we'll use inside the body here in a moment. And this is going to be what gives us the buttons that we want to display when the user will tap the action button to display actions like join a chat, host a chat, and so forth. So we'll create another private method here, action sheet buttons. And this is going to return an array of action sheet buttons. Imagine that. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're just going to create an array of buttons internally as we start to implement this. And that'll be the same thing, action sheet buttons, just empty array. And then at the very bottom, we're going to return that. Okay. So in the middle, we're going to switch over the current app state. And that app state is going to be what determines what buttons we want to display to the user. So we'll switch over the view model app state. And if it's inactive, so there's the user is not, there we go, inactive. So if the user hasn't attempted to join a chat, isn't hosting a chat, and, is just basically sitting there idle, will be in the inactive state. And in that case, we want to let them host a chat or join a chat. So we're going to say buttons plus equals, and we'll be basically appending some buttons to that. So the first one inside of this array here that we see that I just created, we'll do a default button type. And that's going to have a text host chat. Now this type will have an action. Sorry, this button will have an action. So we're going to implement the trailing closure here to add the action that we want. And that action is going to be to take the view models call the view model start advertising. So if we're hosting a chat, so if the user were to tap this button, it's going to cause the view model to start advertising. We implemented that earlier. And now we're advertising as a host and other users can join our chat. Secondly, we're also going to want to add another button, also of the default button type. And the label here will be using the text view to provide the title join chat, right? And so similarly, this will have an action and we'll implement that in the trailing closure. And this will be self.viewModel.start browsing, right? So if I want to host a chat, I'm advertising. If I want to join a chat, I'm browsing. That takes care of our case that we're inactive. For all other cases, so the user is connected or hosting with or without peers, we want to just add to the buttons using the plus equals operator. And just to kind of follow suit, we will be expanding upon this later. We're going to just right now have a single value in there that will be, using a text to provide the ability to disconnect from the session. And the trailing closure for that will be self.viewModel.disconnect. At the very bottom, before we return the buttons, we want to append. In all cases, we want to append a cancel button so that the user can just cancel if they decide they don't want to do anything. All right. So back up here now where we had this text, we can get rid of that for now. Actually, we're going to implement that using the self.caption for message, right? So that's going to return, whether or not this is the local user, it just return the timestamp. Otherwise, we'll return the user's name and the timestamp. Now we're going to start using some view modifiers. So on the text, we'll use the font view modifier, and we're going to change the font type to caption. And notice that the indentation automatically sort of indents it. Makes it easier to understand what view modders are being attached to what view. Sometimes if they're all in line, or for that matter, if you don't wrap them to the next line, it can get pretty difficult to sort of read through and reason about what's happening in a SwiftUI view. Later, we're going to actually abstract or uplift some of these views that we're creating in line here into their own types, just to clean up our content view and make it easier to kind of follow what's going on. But especially when we are working with this initial design phase, it really helps to keep everything wrapped to a new line rather than, say, for example, putting font over here. It's totally a preference thing, but I find that it just makes it easier to read the code. And it's very similar to what we typically do with, say, Combine or other types of reactive programming. Okay, so you have font caption, and then we're going to set the foreground color to gray. That takes care of our text. We are still inside of the for each, so we're basically building out the view that will be displayed for each individual message. And so below that, we're going to create an H stack. And this is a horizontal stack. And inside of that horizontal stack, we want to do the first thing is we want, as we know when we're looking at, say, a chat app or conversation, if we have text that needs to be wrapped to the next line, we want the messages for all other users to be starting along the left edge, but have a little bit of a space between the right edge and the right edge of the screen. And for the messages that we send ourselves, it's exactly the opposite. We want that pinned to the right with a little bit of space to the left. So we're going to do that by using this H stack, and we'll have a couple of conditionals in here to do that. So if message is from local user, don't know why that's not giving me from local user. Oh yeah, I definitely will be recording this. So you'll be able to, if you're not following along in code now and you want to, or just maybe go back later and compare your work, I'll be posting the recording and the final project with each of the commits that you can then, check out each stage of the process here that we go through today, and the slides. So you'll have access to all of that. So if message is from local user, we'll go ahead and add a spacer. Okay, after that if conditional, we're going to create a text message. We're inside this horizontal stack right now, text, and it'll be for the message value. So that's the actual comment. That's the message that was sent when the user hits the send button that we'll be adding here momentarily. And we're going to set the foreground color to white. So the text will be white. We're going to set the font type to body. And we're going to add some padding. And by just adding this padding view modifier by itself, it'll add what the SwiftUI framework feels is the appropriate amount of padding for that context. So it'll do that automatically. I think it's 8 points, but don't quote me. Okay, next we want to actually set a background color. So we're going to say background, and I'm going to hide this for right now just because I know we are dealing with a smaller screen, because I've got my screen display resolution a little higher so you can see the text better. So I'm just going to close that for right now. Message is from local user. I have no idea why I'm not getting code completion. Local user. Then we're going to make it blue. Otherwise, gray. This kind of follows suit with the messages app. Now we'll use a corner radius view modifier to set the corner radius of the message to 20. And now we're going to use a series of padding view modifiers to add different padding based on whether this is the user or not. And so first one we're going to do is padding. And inside the parentheses now we can specify leading. And this is message is, I'm going to copy and paste this because this is not giving me code completion. Is from local user and 20, otherwise 8. And I'm going to do another padding. And we're going to specify the trailing. And we'll say if the message is from local user, 8, otherwise 20. So this is just some fine tuning that I found as I was playing around with implementing this, that this provided the right amount of padding so visually everything looked great. So I've provided both leading and trailing, and now I want to provide both top and bottom. And there are some ways that you can do that without specifying them. If I wanted to, I could actually do in an array here, I could do top and bottom in array and then pass some value. But there's a more convenient way to do that when you do want to provide the same value for both top and bottom, or for that matter, leading and trailing. You can just use either vertical or horizontal, and that'll be the same thing. So it's just a little bit less code, and I want to just provide 5 points there. Okay, after this text message, just like we added some spacing to the left if this is local user, now we're going to add some spacing to the right if it's not the local user. So if message dot is still not working from local user equals false, then we'll add the spacer there. Okay, and I'm going to just see if we can see this on the canvas. Command Option P. Yeah, so let's just take a look at that. See, so we're getting there. And in fact, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but in Xcode 11, you have a live preview capability. You can just click that button, and now we'll actually have something that we can, once this finishes compiling, that we can actually play around with. See, we've actually got our scrollable view, and there's our single hello world message. So pretty cool. All right, I'll hide that for now. And we're almost done, actually. We've got a little more to do, just a little bit though. So that takes care of the message itself. There's one other thing we want to do here, and this kind of gets to the point where we want to see, we need to kind of use, I'm just looking at my scroll view here on my other screen. So we have the scroll view here, and what we want to do is that where the scroll view closing brace is, we want to add another view modifier so we can set a title to this particular screen. We're going to just use that navigation bar title view modifier, navigation bar title, and that will take a text view, and we're going to say view model dot app state dot raw value. We could have created a helper method to actually get to that rather than just doing that in that way. You know, log delimiter there, but this is fine for now. Again, this is demo apps. We want to try to make this as easy to follow and not, you know, go too excessive with all the decoupling and all that. So this is just going to set the app state, the title of the navigation bar to the app state's raw value. So those are those values that we assigned at the very beginning when we were implementing the view model in that enum. And then we want to display this in line. By doing this, this will display in the, not the non-large title, the regular size navigation bar, versus if we didn't do this, then it would default to the prefers large title that goes true, and it would default to the large title. And then when you scroll, it would collapse it to the condensed navigation bar. I just found as I was working with this that it was easier just to make it in line from the start. So that's why I did that. Question?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just asking, I did a demo app in SwiftUI, so I looked into that, and it looks like we have to just apply the navigation bar title on the first child of navigation view. But we are applying here in the scroll view rather than the VStack above it.
Well, I think you could actually apply this navigation bar title to the VStack as well. It actually just has to, you can't apply that to the navigation view directly. You apply it to a descendant of the navigation view. I, for whatever reason, put it on the scroll view.
Okay, so it's not depends on the depth. It can be on any child.
Yeah, if we were to add this, if you were to add it, for example, to something inside the for each, I think that would probably be problematic. It would be unnecessary because it'd be trying to set that title for every value. But it just has to be on a descendant of the navigation view. So in other words, I think I could have actually moved it to right here and had the same effect. And we can just test that by using the live preview. Yeah, I've got a 32 gig Mac, so it's pretty zippy. Let's see. Yeah, so it does. So I could have left that there, but I'll just be consistent because I know the finished version of this product, for whatever reason, I added it to the scroll view itself. So there we go. Okay. All right, so that actually takes care of the chat part. And now we have some work to do to actually build out our action buttons. And we already did create the helper method for that, so we can just kind of continue on here. And I'll hit a couple of spaces to give us some space after that first implementation. Keep in mind that in our next pass at this project, we're going to be extracting these into their own views and really cleaning up our content view, our primary content view. But for now, we're kind of just doing everything in line, which is typically what happens when you're sort of experimenting and designing your SwiftUI based views. So the first thing we're going to do here is what we're going to create is essentially our action buttons that will be displayed, the bottom toolbar that will be displayed that'll have an action button, a text input, and then some additional buttons for clearing things out and sending your message. That's what we're going to create now. And we'll do that in a horizontal stack. And the first thing we're going to do is create a button. And that button will have an action. And that action will be self.showActionSheet equals true. So the button's action is that, and now we need to use the trailing closure to provide what we want to be displayed on the button. And in this case, we're going to use an image using the system image name. And if you type this in exactly, you don't make a misspelling, you'll be good to go, because we're using the SF symbols library here, square and arrow up, separated by dots. Square and arrow up. Okay. And on this particular button, I want to add some padding. And so I'll just wrap this to the next line. Padding horizontal because we want both leading and trailing, horizontal. We want that to be 8 points. Okay, so this will be an action button that we'll see on the toolbar on the left, on the bottom, that you tap to display the buttons to host or join a chat, for example. Okay, next we're going to implement the input, and this will be how the user types in their message. So text field. Oops, sorry. This will be, sorry, let's just do that again. Text field, there we go. And the text field, we're going to pass in the view model to app state dot not connected. So here's that not connected helper Boolean property that we implemented way back when. And that will be inactive if it's not connected. Otherwise, it will be add message. I'm going to just wrap this to the next line, make it a little easier to read. The next parameter for this text field is the actual text that we want to bind it to. And so what's happening here is we're saying this text field is going to have some text that when the user types in will be updated. We want to take that value and bind it to our publisher on our view model, because this is what, when we then turn around and hit send to send that message, that value will be consulted within the view model to send that message. And so we've completely encapsulated that logic in the view model rather than any of that being in here in the SwiftUI view. So in order to access that publisher, if you remember, we use a $, and now we see we get our code completion gives us, a list of the publishers that we have available to us in this scope. And so the one we want, of course, is the view model, and we want the new message text. Did I maybe make that private by accident? Let's see. Message text. And then we'll close that out. And that should, let's see what's going on here. Oh, I see what happened. I have the closing parentheses here. I don't want that there. There we go. Okay, so this text field has these two properties, or these two parameters here. The first is we're indicating what the label is that it's going to be displayed as the placeholder text for that text field, and then the actual binding for the text as it's being entered into that text field. So that's how we would use the text field view in SwiftUI. And we'll add a couple of modifiers here. We want text field style, and we want that to be rounded border text field style. And that's actually just, you actually implement that as an instance of that style. Then we also want to handle when this is disabled, and I'll explain that in a moment. So view model dot app state dot not connected. So what's happening is we don't want the user to be able to enter text into this text field if the user is not connected. So right, so once they connect and now they're able to send messages, because we wouldn't want them to give the user a false sense of being able to send messages when they're not actually connected to a chat. That's why we're using this disabled view modifier. And if we're not connected, then we disable the text field from being able to receive input. Okay, we have another couple of buttons to create. So the first one is so button. The action will be self.viewModel.clear. And I'll explain why we're doing this way here in a moment. But the display that we want for that is going to be an image using the system name, if I can spell, system name, xmark.circle. So xmark.circle. And this will be disabled when the view model new message text is empty. New message text is empty. So what's happening with this button? So we're using a regular text field. And in the other project that I gave a session on a couple days ago, I used a search bar. So I created a UI search view wrapped in a SwiftUI view, and I used that for searching for GitHub gists by user. And I could have actually used a search bar here as well, although we would have dealt with some of the, we'd have to then customize it so it doesn't look like we're searching, because in this case, we're actually not searching, we're just entering in text. But what's happening is in SwiftUI, this text field does not currently have the ability to show the, the little X within the body of the text field as you would with a UI text field, so that the user can just tap that and clear out the text. That doesn't exist for the text field implementation in SwiftUI yet. I would expect maybe this will be improved upon in coming releases. So we're just creating a way ourselves that we can allow the user to clear out that text instead of having to hit backspace a bunch of times. So we're going to disable that when the message text is empty. There's nothing to clear out, so the button will be disabled. And that's all we're doing there. And I think as you start to play around with SwiftUI, and some of you looks like you already have been, I think you'll find that there are some of these types of workarounds and different ways to go about implementing things that maybe would even seem easier to do in UIKit. But like I said, I'm fairly confident that a lot of these things will be improved upon in the next major release of SwiftUI. And we might find that we'll go back to this project, for example, and do things differently in a more streamlined way. Maybe it would just be a view modifier, show cancel button, something like that. Okay, so in any event, we've just implemented the ability to clear out the text if it's not empty. And the last one we want to do is we want to create a button to actually send the message. So button, and that'll be action. And that'll be self.viewModel.send. Oops, not session, send. There we go. And then the display for that will be an image, system name, paper, plain. And this will be disabled when the view model's new message text is empty as well. And we want to add a little more padding. I found when I was playing around with the layout of this, I wanted to add a little more padding. So I'm going to do padding dot horizontal for this button. We'll set that to 8. Okay, a couple more view modifiers and we're ready to run our app. Below the implementation of this H stack, we want to add some padding. So we're going to go right to the closing curly brace of this H stack. Just add a padding view modifier. Control I is how you can easily re-indent lines so everything lines up nicely. We're going to set the background of this based on the color scheme. So if the color scheme is equal to dark, then we'll say color black. Otherwise, color white. Now, remember earlier, we spent a good amount of time writing code that would handle that keyboard offset and the keyboard animation duration and all of that. We're going to actually put that to work now. So in this offset view modifier, we're going to offset just the Y value based on the view model's keyboard offset. So all that work in the view model makes it really easy to consume this piece of state in the SwiftUI view. So we have the offset, and now we're going to set the animation to use an ease in and out animation type, and the duration will be the view model's keyboard animation duration. We also want to animate adding our messages to the scroll view, to the chat. So we're going to go down to the body of our scroll view, which is going to be, where are we at here? Right here, right? It's basically the next curly brace after this body that we just completed. And we're going to say animation dot ease in out. And then, oh, right. Okay, so then the other thing is, if you tap into the text field to start typing in text, we now have set up our view to shift up by the keyboard's height, and you'll be able to type your message. However, there's no built-in way in SwiftUI to resign the first responder on that text field. So if you were to tap on that chat, you would not be dismissing the keyboard. The keyboard would sort of be stuck presented for the rest of the time until you quit the app. And so one way that I found to handle this, there's a couple different things you can do, and I've explored doing them in different projects. But in this case, I'm going to use the on tap gesture. So when we tap on this scroll view, we're going to use the UI application .main. Sorry, UI application that's shared. Sorry, that's shared. dot windows. And we're going to reach into the first one where it is the key window. Is key window. I'm using optional chaining here. And then we're going to call end editing true. True. Okay, so all that's happening here is that whenever we tap on the scroll view, we want to just dismiss the keyboard. And now the last thing we need to do here is, it looks like I might be missing, I might have my curly braces not in the right places. Let's see here. I'll double check that in a moment. But I'm pretty sure we want this action sheet to be right here. Oh, that looks right, actually. I take that back. Action sheet. So this is the actual action sheet that's going to display those buttons that we created, that method right below, or that method right below it to create our buttons for us. So action sheet, and that's the wrong one, action sheet. And we're going to use the one that has the is presented initial parameter. And we'll use this binding. So we have a binding here. When I use the $ to reach to the show action sheet binding. And the content of that, you can just kind of delete that and then implement the trailing closure syntax instead. We're going to create an action sheet. And we're going to say title is going to be a text view of the view models action sheet title. We don't have a message, so we don't have to worry about that. And the buttons will be the return value of that action sheet buttons method that we created earlier. All right, let's just build and make sure that looks good. There is one other thing I want to do before we run this app and then take a break. And that's, I want to go down to this content previews here. And right now, if we were to show this, all we're going to see is that iPhone, just do Command Option P. We're going to see that iPhone 11 Pro Max in the light mode being displayed. That's the default that you get. Sometimes though, especially when you're designing, it's nice to be able to see multiple things without having to run them to a simulator, and the preview provider has you covered there. So the first thing we want to do is, it's some views. We actually have to create a group for this. We're going to create a group. This is just a way that you can logically group together multiple views. So we'll create this view. And for the first one, I'm going to add a view modifier called preview device. And this takes a string. And I think there is a repo out on GitHub somebody created to make these enum cases or something like that, instead of making them strings, because it would be easy to make them a typo here, of course, and then it wouldn't display correctly. But in this case, we're going to type in iPhone 11 Pro Max. That's what we currently have, but I'm just being explicit. And then we also want to do preview display name. And this is just a nice way that you can indicate what, some message that will be displayed at the bottom of that preview. And we'll do the same thing. So we're just going to copy and paste that text. Now I'm going to just re-indent that, and then I'll copy and paste this whole thing and create a second preview right below it. In this one, we want this to be an iPhone SE. iPhone. Yes.
Yeah, there's this typo here, iPhone H capital.
Ah, thank you. See what I tell you? I didn't do that on purpose. Thanks for catching that. Okay, and the last thing I'll do is I'll add a view modifier to this, this iPhone SE, and I'm going to set the environment color scheme to dark. And so just like that, we have previews for both the iPhone 11 Pro Max in light mode and the iPhone SE in dark mode. Now, when you click the play for the live preview, it'll only live preview one at a time. So just don't forget if you want to go back to looking at multiple designs. So if I do that, for example, here, and I just click the play, I can now look and see what this is going to look like on my iPhone SE in dark mode, but I don't see the iPhone 11 Pro Max until I stop the live preview. And there's another thing that's kind of cool. We don't do it in this project or in this workshop, but if you option click or sorry, control click on that play button, you can debug preview, and that will also then allow you to print things to the console. I didn't realize this until recently, but it's a nice convenience thing versus having to run it to the simulator to see your console printouts. So if you are doing anything where you're logging anything and you go to debug preview, that will actually cause those console statements to be printed out. Otherwise, they wouldn't. So just a little tip there. All right, what we've all been waiting for, and we've toiled through a lot of code here to get to this point. This is the biggest unit of work in this workshop today. Let's go ahead and pick a device, and we'll build and run to it. And I'm gonna pick the iPhone 11 Pro Max to start. And this will launch here momentarily. There we go. Now, in order for this to work, we need to have the ability to host a chat and join a chat. Otherwise, we're inactive and we can't type in any text. So I'm going to go back to my Xcode and then choose another device, and I'll run that. And I'm going to do a third one too, just for fun. I'll do the iPhone 8 this time, and I will run that. So you'll notice that when you run a simulator, the other simulators do in fact stop running. So I'll just go ahead and rerun those other ones there. So I've got crosstalk on all 3 devices, okay? And I'll say that the iPhone 8 is going to be the host, so it's going to host the chat. And now it's waiting for peers. And now I'm going to join the chat. I'm now connected and I can add a message. Hello. I can say, what's up? This one is not connected yet, so I'll go ahead and join. And I'll say, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I don't want to do that. I'll clear it out and say, I'm new here. And send that. So that's our initial implementation. And of course, if I were to disconnect from this chat, these would be automatically disconnected and revert to inactive. And if I reconnect by hosting this one and joining, right now I'm hosting chat, but if I disconnect and I disconnect, I go back to waiting for peers. So all of the bells and whistles line up correctly with this, and we've got a nice implementation here. The messages are added from the top. That's why we inserted at index 0. And so it's a little bit backwards from what we typically expect with the UX we're looking for with a chat app, is that we want the messages to appear from the bottom, don't we? And they scroll upwards. Well, guess what? SwiftUI does not currently have the ability to have a reversible scroll view, but I did find a couple different implementations online that seem to provide a pretty workable solution for that. And I sort of melded them together and modified things slightly for my purposes here. And we're going to be coming back to this in a little while, and we'll be creating a reversible scroll view to do exactly that. So what we'll do now is we'll take a break for about 10 minutes. We'll say at 35 past the hour, and we'll continue on. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through this SwiftUI view here that we created, and we're going to extract the message, and we're going to extract the toolbar so we can clean up our content view, and we'll move those into their own separate view files. Okay, I will stop here. I'm happy to hang out for a couple minutes if anybody has any questions before we sort of adjourn for a 10-minute break.
Hey, Scott, can you scroll to the action sheet line?
To the action sheet buttons line?
Perfect. Thanks.
Yep. Mm-hmm. See if there's any other questions here. What's the append line look? Oh, that was you, Dave. Yeah. Okay. So I'll also ask, and if you want to send me a private message, if you prefer, that's fine too. If this pacing is good for everyone, if you can hear me okay, if there's anything that you have any suggestions that would help to make this better. I know that, you know, generally in an online classroom type of environment, we try to get a little more interactivity engagement, but we have a lot to go over today, and this is more of sort of like a presentation workshop. So I hope this is workable for everyone, and you're able to follow along if that's what you're wanting to do. And as I mentioned, I'll be publishing a recording of this. So if you want to be able to, pause, implement, consider, look things up, come back and continue, you'll have the opportunity to do that later. But also you have the opportunity to ask questions along the way now, and you can't ask questions to a video. So where will it be posted? I'll be posting this on my social media, including my Twitter and on my LinkedIn. So it should be easy for you to find. It'll take, probably, it won't get posted till later tonight because I usually get the video, download it, and then do a very little bit of editing to just edit out the ahs and ums and unnecessary periods of waiting and that kind of thing. And then I'll post it, a cleaned up version of that recording for you. Okay, we're at 25 past right now, so I will see everyone in about 10 minutes. Okay, we're gonna get started with our next section here. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so this is gonna be a light one. All we're gonna basically do is extract each of the views. And what I'm gonna do just before I do that actually is just go to terminal. And I'm going to just go to my desktop where this project is. And I'm just going to commit these changes. And I think we'll just call that initial implementation. Okay, good enough. Great. Okay, I'm just doing that to make it easier for me to differentiate where my changes are existing. So you feel free to do that if you like. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to do two things here. First thing is we're going to take this view model and that we're currently just instantiating here in the content view, and we're going to uplift it to be an environment object. So we're going to go to the scene delegate. And where we have this content view that was created for us in the default implementation, we're going to use the environment object modifier and add to that content view a chat view model instance. Now, something I want to point out to you here. We're doing this at the highest level, right? At the scene delegate essentially that is called for each scene that will be displayed for this app. And it could be more than one, but we're doing this here. And in order for an environment object to be able to be called upon in any of your views, the environment object actually has to be presented by an ancestor. So we have to set that environment object by an ancestor, otherwise we won't be able to access it in some descendant view, some child view. That's a really important thing. And if you tried to do it, you ran the app, you'd probably get a crash with a fairly helpful error message that basically explains that that's the situation. So we're creating it here and we're assigning this chat view model in the scene delegate. And now we can go back to our chat view, our content view. And we're going to change this implementation of the environment of the observed object to be an environment object of view model. We don't instantiate it now because it already is instantiated. So we're just going to say of type chat view model. And if we build that, everything should work exactly the same because we've just basically uplifted the initialization of that to be an environment object instead. And so when would you use environment object? Well, there's a few different places. I find that it makes a lot of sense to do that when we have services that we want to provide, or maybe sometimes some values or objects that we want to provide globally. I wouldn't get too carried away with it, but those are generally some good use cases for it. I kind of think of this as the sort of the opposite of dependency injection, is sort of dependency pulling on demand. So if we have initialized in the scene delegate, for example, then any of our descendant views would be able to access that environment object if they need it, as opposed to manually injecting them into the initializer or using something like a dependency container. That's something you're familiar with. This sort of cleans up that process. And when you're working within a declarative SwiftUI environment like this, you might find that that's a better pattern to follow. Something, just food for thought there. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to just collapse this for right now. Go to canvas. Next thing we're going to do, I created a VStack around these so that I could more easily extract them, because you'll want to have a VStack around the type that you're going to extract into a subview. Now, what I've also found is that sometimes when you do this, so when I command click, I don't always get the opportunity to extract to subview. It doesn't always, this one works here, but it doesn't work, it's not even showing it there. So I found some inconsistencies there with Xcode. And so we're gonna have to do this manually. And the way we'll do that is we're going to right click on our views, new file, SwiftUI view, and we're gonna call this the ChatScrollView. Okay, and in that ChatScrollView, let me just see here. We're going to go back to the content view, and we're going to do a couple things. First of all, we have the message that we want to extract as well. So actually, we'll create that first, and then we'll extract the whole thing in one fell swoop. So what we're going to do here is we're going to also create a type in our views called message view of SwiftUI view. There we go. So this message view is actually going to be the body that we currently have inside of this content view. That's going to be the text with the caption and the H stack that contains the padding and all that. So all of this is going to be a message view instead. So we're going to go all the way down to here, which is the closing curly brace of the H stack. And we're going to cut that out of there and move that into our message view. And we'll just paste that in here. Now, in order for this to work, we actually need to wrap this in a VStack because right now we're trying to provide multiple views back for the type, which is just a single view. So that's why we need to do that. And we'll just wrap that in a VStack. And then just select that same text. Could have just done this first and then pasted in there, would have been just as easy. All right. And what we want to do now is we're going to get a compiler error because we don't actually have this message property. And so we're just going to create a property that will automatically be required to be passed when we're initializing this message view called message of type message. And we're also going to go back to that content view and grab that caption for, which actually is applicable to the message, not the content view anymore. And we'll just paste that in here. There we go. So what's happening here is we have this preview is now expecting that message to be provided, and we don't have one. So we could do one of two things. We could fill this out with a default message, or because we're going to be looking at this inside of the context of the ChatScrollView anyway, we're going to just delete the preview here. We're not going to have a preview for this particular view. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can go back to the content view. And what we have left here is this scroll view with a VStack with the for each in it. And we're going to copy that out. And we're going to paste that into our ChatScrollView. And we're going to need access to the view model here. So because this is a descendant view, we can go ahead and add that environment object. Make that a private var view model, type view model, chat view model, that is, chat view model. And let's see, scroll view, VStack, for each. Oh, I see what's going on. So what's happening here is I just haven't implemented the body of my message yet. So I'm going to do that now, message view. And that'll take the message. Great. That's failing only because we haven't updated our content view yet. So let's go back to our content view. And now we just have that single chat scroll view implementation. So we just kind of extracted, manually so, but we extracted that ChatScrollView into its own type. And I mentioned earlier that I had that nested on the scroll view. We actually can move that down to, let's just see here. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now, but that could have been moved down to the enclosing VStack as well. All right, so the next thing we want to do is this whole section here, this whole block of code is the toolbar that I've referred to a couple times now. And what we'll do is we will basically extract all of that and see if I can use the command click. It doesn't let us do that there either. So we're going to extract all that into a toolbar view. So we'll right click on views, new file, SwiftUI. Next, call this toolbar view. And we'll go back to this H stack and copy all of this out. Now, what you'll notice is, and I'll just copy that or cut that to my clipboard, and then I'll just do toolbar view and initialize that. And then I'll just re-indent these. You'll notice that when we have properties or view modifiers, I should say, that are modifying a view, we will often want to just have those be separate of the actual implementation. So things that are specific to the view that it's being presented in would still be view modifiers on that view, not included within the implementation that itself. So that's why I left those there. And now we'll just go ahead and paste that in here. And that'll be our toolbar view. And I believe we'll need to add some properties to that. We sure will. That will be the environment object for the view model. Environment object, private var view model, chat view model. And we're also going to need to do a new thing that I'm going to explain in a moment called a binding. And that'll be var show action sheet. Cool. And once again, we have this scenario where we would want to update our toolbar views to provide those values here. And just for sake of showing you this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement the missing value that it's looking for, the missing parameter. It's looking for a show action sheet binding. And when you have to do this in a SwiftUI preview, you can provide a constant here, which just allows us to provide a value. In this case, we're going to say false. We want to not show the action sheet by default in our preview. And then we're going to need to set the environment object, and that'll just be an instance of the chat view model. This is just for the purposes of the preview. This is not for the production implementation. And then lastly, when you are presenting, so if I were to show this right now, I'm not sure if it'll compile just yet. If I were to show this right now, let's see, it would be the full device Chrome around this particular view, and this is just the toolbar. Yeah, this it's not going to compile yet. I have to fix one other thing. But the point that I want to show you, we can come back and look at it later, is that you can also do preview layout size that fits. And what this would do is just show the toolbar in this preview window without the device Chrome or entire device being displayed around it, which is nice if you've got a lot of these different types of views that you don't have to load up, especially if you're doing multiple preview styles for different environments like dark or light mode or what have you. It's nice to be able to just see them without all that extra space being taken up. Let's go back to our content view and see what's going on there. Right, so this toolbar view now needs that binding to the show action sheet. And what we're going to do here, so that's the binding that we just created, the @binding property wrapper on the toolbar view at the top here. And this is how you can assign state through to a subview, in this case, a child, where there's still one source of truth. The state actually is in the containing content view, and we're allowing ourselves to pass that state through so that it can be bound to a two-way bind between this toolbar view and where the truth lies, which is in the content view itself. So it's state here, and it's a binding in the child view. And that is important. You wouldn't want to have a show action sheet state in the toolbar view, because those would be two different observable properties, and they would not be in sync with each other, right? By using this binding property wrapper in the toolbar, we're able to use the binding here by using the $ show action sheet. And now that two-way bind will allow this toolbar view to update that show action sheet binding, in this case, setting it to true when the user taps to show the action sheet button. And that will automatically update this state here, which is referenced for purposes of displaying this action sheet. So you see how these views are able to consult one source of truth and do the right thing using these observable bindings. And I think that's all we needed to do here. So let's go ahead and just run this app. Make sure everything still works as advertised. I'll run it on a couple of devices. That one is, can actually close that one for right now. And so we'll just make a host and we'll join the host. And sure enough, everything still works as advertised. So we haven't changed anything. We just refactored things so that our content view is cleaned up and is, just focused on the individual components that are separately defined in their own files and their own types. All right, so give me 1 minute. I'm just going to switch over my reference project to a different version, and then we'll continue on. Okay, so let's see here. I'm going to go back to my get my source control here, and I'm going to add those changes we just made, and I'll just commit that. And we'll just say that is going to be extract subviews and create environment object. Great. Awesome. Okay, so let's actually hide this for right now. And so for our next set of work, we're going to add that reversible chat scroll view that I mentioned earlier. So in order to do that, because there's quite a bit of implementation, we won't have the time to kind of work through all that code. I'm going to pull it in, and then we're going to take a look at it. So if you go to your desktop, wherever you downloaded your crosstalk resources, and you currently see this app icon set we've already used and the Yandex API text, which we're going to use when we get to the translation part of this project, and just do Command-Shift period if you don't already see this hidden folder, and it's just going to be a reversible chat scroll view. And if you take that file and drag that into your views, make sure you copy items if needed. And let's take a quick look at that. So there's a couple of reference links that I pointed to that I found as being helpful for this. And so, so you can refer those if you'd like. And what's basically happening here is this is another SwiftUI view with some properties and some observable properties. And this is working with these preference changes with what are called preference keys in SwiftUI in order to affect having the ability to make the scroll view scroll in the reverse. So this is sort of an example of where SwiftUI has some room for improvement. This was, it's a pretty good amount of code to make this happen. So we won't dig into this, but feel free to look it over. I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have about it later on. And we're just going to use it as is for right now. It should work how we want it to work. We're getting a extra argument is translating and call. Oh, that's interesting. That's because we don't have in translating set up yet. So let's just take that out for right now. That should hopefully solve for us. Yep. So that's just an artifact. If you were to go through the different commits, you might find that the version that you'd be looking at in the commit is this, but the end result file shouldn't have had that in there. We add that in later. Okay, so let's go now to our chat view model. Let's see what we need to change here. Yep, we've got a couple of changes to make here. Okay, so let's go to our chat view model. And the property we're looking at is for the safe area insets bottom. Let's see. I think that's fine as is, actually. It is. The thing we do need to change, though, is in the insert method, So if you remember earlier, in this insert method, we are inserting at index 0 because we had a top loading, a top scrolling scroll view, right? Top to bottom. We're reversing that with this reversible here, and we'll do that in a moment. But in the meanwhile, what we're going to do is just reverse this from being insert to append. And it'll append the message at the end of the collection of the array of messages, and therefore be at the bottom, and it'll come up from the bottom just as you'd expect. That's all we need to do there. And then we're going to go to the content view, and we're going to replace this chat scroll view with an instance of this reversible chat scroll view. And it's going to require passing the color scheme. We'll just pass that value that we have defined previously straight through. We want to reverse it, so we'll say true. Oops. And scroll to end, we also want to say true. So that way, when the new message is added, it automatically scrolls to the bottom. We're also going to use that offset that we defined earlier. And that offset, we need to do this because of the way that this particular scroll view will display with reference to the bottom safe area inset. And so we're going to offset the Y value by the view model, keyboard offset plus the view model safe area inset. And even as I write safe, oh, I did need to add that property. That was the thing missing there. Let me comment that out for a moment. Let's go back to our view model. And I did add a new property there, so I was correct in that at least. Okay. So what we're adding is we're adding a safe area inset bottom to our view model. Where's it at here? Safe area inset bottom. Well, that's already there. So let's see.
It's a static property, it's not instance.
It's what?
It's a static property, not an instance property. That's why.
Yeah.
Oh, right. So let me go back to that. Okay, so let me go back to my content view here. I'm just wondering, I'm seeing like just a little bit of a discrepancy between what I have in my reference project and here. So I want to make sure I do that right. Interesting. Hold on. Oh, yeah, so that's interesting. So basically, I did implement this twice for some reason. It looks like safe area inset bottom as both a static property and as an instance property in my project through these different steps. So you're right. I just need to, so I'll clean that up. So we'd actually just need to make this view model, it would actually be chat view model dot safe area inset bottom. There we go. Yeah, thank you. Okay, that takes care of that. So let's take a look and see if there's anything else here. I think that would be it for that. And let's run the app. Let's see how it looks. So there is an offset here that I'm not seeing why that would be the case. I'm definitely missing something here. So what I'll do is I think I might have made a change to my view model. We'll tell you what, we'll just take a quick 5-minute break. We'll literally come back at 5 past the hour. I'll just figure out what it is that I'm missing here rather than having you all sit here and watch me figure that out. And we'll be back in 5 minutes. We'll get started. I did figure out what it was that I just hadn't finished implementing yet. So I'm all set with that. We've got a couple minutes while we're waiting for people that might have stepped away for that 5-minute window. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
Is it the addition and subtraction of safe area inside bottom?
Is it what? It's addition.
Yeah,
Yep, it's addition because we want to basically push the offset that much more. That's the problem that's happening here. So what's going to happen is I just need to add that additional safe area inset bottom to my toolbar view. That's, you know, I kind of, when I was designing this and kind of working with that reversible scroll view, there were some interesting gotchas that I ran into there. And what I discovered was I needed to adjust the offset of the toolbar view as well. So that's what I'll be doing when we come back to, working on the project.
Okay.
Yep. I did end up creating in my project, as I kind of went through this, I did end up creating both a static and a instance property for the same thing. So I'm just going to continue using the static version of it. We don't need it twice. Kind of do it either way, really, but the net result is the same. I also did notice as I was sort of consulting my spreadsheet that I kept track of my practice run through this, how much time it took to get through everything, that we're a little bit behind in terms of how much I was able to accomplish in the amount of time that we've spent so far. So I think we had this slotted for another half an hour, and we still want to finish this section up and then add translation. And actually adding the translation is a good amount of code. So we will, I will continue working through that. We might run longer than 3.5 hours, but if you do need to leave for any reason, that's totally fine. Once again, I will be posting the recording so you can circle back later and pick up where you left off if that's necessary. So I don't want anyone to feel like they need to stick around so you have to get back to work, or, it is Friday afternoon after all. So, go enjoy your evening, or if it's your evening, if you're somewhere else, it might be the morning for all I know. So
No, it's actually night in India.
Right. So, all right, we've got just another minute. I don't want to leave anybody behind if they did take that break. So I'll get started here in just a minute. But like I said, I know exactly what it was that I need to do, and we'll just move forward like that. It's actually kind of a neat set of APIs. I've used the multipeer connectivity stuff before on some other things, and but I hadn't used it in a while, and it's pretty useful, and it actually is pretty reliable as well, as far as, I've tested this with multiple devices, either on the same network or even not on a network and using Bluetooth, and it's like I said, it works nicely. So kind of a neat feature. It's surprising that more apps don't take advantage of this.
Yeah, I heard about just in this project only.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to get going. So what we had happen here is that in this reversible, I have this offset, and yet when I ran the app, I see that this is happening here. And what I needed to do to fix that was actually to go into my toolbar, and I need to adjust the padding for, I'm going to add a padding view modifier for the bottom. And I'm going to set that to the view model, chat view model, safe area, inset bottom. And then I also need to create an offset, a change to that offset here. So the offset is going to be the view model keyboard offset plus view model dot safe area. Once again, chat view model, safe area, inset bottom. So this could be cleaned up, and we could actually pull this into a new property, or make some changes to the view model. So we're not doing this addition here. We don't need to do that twice. I didn't get around to doing that, but you certainly could. And I think now, if I'm looking over my Delta here, I think I'm good to go. And if I run this, we should see what we're looking for. Yes. Okay, so let's run this on a couple of apps, a couple of devices, I mean. And we'll say host, and we'll say join. Hey, how's this helpful workshop? You get what you pay for. LOL. Okay, so we see that everything's working as expected, and you can continue to add messages, and that just demonstrates the spacing for a multi-wrap message and the label showing correctly and all that good stuff. So we're good. So we'll continue on here. Let me switch over to this, and we're going to just make a real quick commit, git add status commit. And we'll say this is going to be add ReversibleChatScrollView. That's all we did there. Okay. All right, let me switch over to my next and final diff, add translation. Now, this one does have a good amount of code changes to it, so we'll just work through it, get it done, and and then do a wrap up. But we might run a little long. Hopefully if you can stick around, great. And I totally understand if you can't. All right, so the first thing we're gonna do, we need to update a couple things on the message. So let me explain what's gonna happen. In the action, when you are connected to a chat, you'll have an additional option here that'll say start translating. And then when you are translating and you tap the action, it'll say you'll have an option to stop translating. And this is only gonna work on chat messages from that point forward. Again, an improvement to the app might be that you would go over the existing messages and send out and get translations for those too. Go for it. If you do that and you do something really cool to take this project to the next level and you wanna share that on social media, definitely ping me, I'd love to check it out. Okay, so for this message, we're gonna basically now also add some state to this to manage the language code, the translation language code, and the translated value of the message. So we'll just add those right after the timestamp, let language code be of type string, let translation language code of type string, and let translated value be of type string. Secondly, we want to just add a convenience computed property to be able to determine if this message has been translated yet. Translated of type bool. And the way we're going to do that is by just consulting the translated value dot is empty equals false. If we have a value for the translated value, then we know this has been translated. Just a convenience method there. Okay. Now we're going to need to create a new type. And this is sort of, we're going to call this sort of a DTO or a data transfer object. And we're going to add that here. And this is going to be what we use to receive the translation response, decode it, and make it available for updating the message. So we'll create that as a regular Swift file. And we'll call this translation response. And this is just going to be a struct of translation response. It needs to be codable. And we'll create an enum coding key here. What's happening is this is the translation API that we're going to use is going to be called Yen. It's a service provided by a company called Yen. It's free to use, and I have an API key that we'll be using here in a moment. And they provide translations back as an array. So we're using this intermediary type to be able to receive that decoded data, get our array, and then get to the first value, which is actually going to be the one that we want. So we have this coding keys of type string and coding key. And the case language code, as we're going to refer to it, will be lang. And translations, as we refer to it, will be text. That's kind of how they did it. Below that, we'll create our properties. Whoops. Let language code of type string, and let translation be of an array of string. Type translation response not conform to decodable. Translation response. Let's see.
The coding keys, translations with an S at the end.
Coding keys. Ah, is that right?
No, the second one is translations with an S. So it's plural. And at the bottom, you have translation.
Ah, thank you. Okay, so that's right. That's fine. We have some other things to do here, but we'll keep going. That's what was missing there. Okay. So we're going to have a good amount of changes to be made here in the view model. We'll just get started from the top. So we'll go into the chat view model. And we're going to add another published property. And this will be also a private set. Var. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's take that back. Let's go to our messages. With our messages, here we go. And we're just going to separate this and we'll wrap this to its own line. All we're doing here is we're going to be updating this. So let's say we're going to say messages, message username, value, timestamp. And what we're doing here is we just need to update this to now provide for the other properties that we just added to that language code value. Sorry. There we go. So we have the timestamp, and then we have the language code, and we're going to just set that here to English. That's if you have a different default language code on your device, by all means, you can set it to whatever you'd like. This is the language code that your regular message is being received into. It actually probably will be English for everyone, but translation language code will be empty for this initial hello world, and then translated value would also be an empty string. All right, so that takes care of that. Next, we have a couple of additional properties that we want to create here, and I will do that right here. And the first one is going to be let translation language code. And really, you can make this whatever you'd like. I'm going to just set mine to ES for Spanish. I think in the project that you can download, the final version of this project, it is set to NL, and you can do it whatever you like. I'm going to set mine to Spanish, ES. All right, and then I'm going to I created a property to model the action sheet title just to say actions. We're going to change that from displaying a question to just displaying action sheet title. So action sheet title equals actions. Sorry, actions. Okay. So I've got a few different sort of changes that I made to this. Oh, I know, we're taking this out altogether is what's happening. So this could probably just be a let. And I did that because now we're adding this translation, and it just would seem like a good way to simplify things for purposes of finishing up the app. So I have some additional properties that we use here. One is for a JSON decoder. Interesting. All right, private lazy var decoder. This is probably a scenario where, as I was going through and developing this, I realized, oh, we should have just actually created a property to use it for decoding rather than using a new one every time. And so I went ahead and did that, but that ended up happening later in my dev cycle. So this is a sort of an improvement refactor kind of thing. The next thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to create a translation service. So it's going to be a lazy var translation service. And we haven't implemented this yet, so we'll go ahead and do that in a moment, but I'll just, it's going to be called translation service. And we'll create an instance of that. And we're also going to need, we already have subscriptions, so we're all set there. Okay. So let me just comment that out for a minute while I go ahead and implement this translation service. And we'll add a new folder called services. So a new group, right click on crosstalk, new group. And we'll just call this services. I'll move that to the bottom, right above of supporting files, and right click in there, new file, and translation service. Okay, so what this is going to do, and we're going to need combine in here as well, so import combine, is this is going to use the Yandex translation service to take a string, fetch a translation, and provide a publisher for that. So the first thing we'll need to do is, well, first of all, define it as a translation service, and we're going to need to do use an API key here. So the API key is going to be equal to a string, and if you go to your downloaded resources and just open up that text file, just copy and paste that whole string into your project. Of course, we don't want any return. There we go. So there's your API key that we'll be using. You can create an API key for free. So if you are creating your own apps, be sure to use your own API key. This is just for this app. Okay, so func, I'm going to create a publisher for the message. So we're going to pass a message to this of type message. Oh, sorry, just message, not message view, to language code. And that'll be of a string. And this is going to return in any publisher of type data. And I'll talk about this, what this is in a minute, and URL error. So this is the first time we're seeing this in this project. This is a very typical pattern that you will see when you're creating publishers. And what's happening here is we're specifying the inputs that we want in order to build up this publisher. And we're going to be returning in a type erased publisher. And the reason why we do that, there's two reasons, I think. One is that we want to avoid letting the call site know any details about the publisher, or for that matter, be able to set any values on that publisher. You notice we've been using private set with the @publish property wrapper because that prevents the call site from being able to set values on that publisher. But when we're creating our own publishers like this, by type erasing it, we're also achieving the same effect. So we're saying any publisher, anytime you define your own publisher, if you'll remember, I mentioned at the very beginning in the slides that a publisher can complete with a finished event, or it can complete with a failure with an error. And so whenever we define a publisher, we need to define what types of values it is going to publish. And then if it's going to publish, potentially publish an error, if it's going to be able to finish with an error, then what that error type is. And in the case where you had a publisher that is never going to emit any errors, or you're going to handle those errors internally, essentially, you would use never. So you still have to specify something, but you would specify never. However, in this case, we are going to be potentially emitting a failure with a URL error event here. So now that we're inside this publisher, we're going to just reach into the URL session APIs, the shared session. And there is now, with Combine, a data task publisher for URL. And so here we're going to, oh, I see. Here we're going to hold on for a second while I implement the method that's going to give us that URL. So I'll just do a private method, URL for message of type message, language code, type string, and this is going to vend a URL. So I'm going to use the URL components APIs here to build this up. So I'm going to say var components equals URL components. And this is smart to do this whenever you have user input especially, but it's just a convenient way to build up your URL using the individual components that make it up. So scheme is going to be HTTPS, components.host is going to be translate.yandex.net, components.path, and we'll have to make sure we type this exactly, API/v1, sorry, v1 dash, or sorry, .5, tr.json/translate. And that is just the endpoint that this particular translation API requires you to use. And then components, and I'm going to create, I'm going to pause there for a moment. I'm going to create just an extension. I usually do this whenever I implement a project where I am using, just the native APIs for my networking. I just create this helpful little extension called on URL components, which allows us to, it's a mutating method. So it's a mutating method set query items, and with parameters, which we'll be able to pass in. Those will just be of type string and string keys and string values. And we're just going to now say query items equals parameters dot map. URL query item. The name will be the key, and the value will be the value. Like I said, just a convenience method way to set your query parameters when you're using URL components APIs. So now that I've done that, I can just say components.set query items, and it's going to be with key will be API key. Text will be the message value, and lang will be the language code. And finally, we're going to return our URL, sorry, we're going to return our components.url, and we know what we're doing here, so we're going to force unwrap that rather than getting involved with any more details on that.
You have a typo on the components.path line.
Components.path. Translate. Thanks for catching that. That would have, I probably would have been banging my head against the wall for, do I still have a typo? Let's see, that looks weird, but I think that's correct. Yeah, thanks for catching that. Okay, so now we're going back up to our data task publisher, and we're going to call that helpful method that we just created URL for message language code. And we're going to now map. So when we map on the result that is returned, it's not a result type. It's actually a tuple. So we're going to use the key path here that returns the data and the response. So in a more elaborate implementation of using the data task publisher API, you would, of course, in fact, maybe want to take that response and filter or do some mapping on that to determine if the response status code should be treated as an error, and as such, then throw an error that gets sent downstream. So that's just something to be aware of. But in this case, we're just going to be reaching in for the data. We're going to handle it that way. And then in order to match the function type, the return type is the any publisher. We're going to use the erase to any publisher operator. And so when you're working with publishers, I mentioned there was 2 reasons why we did this, and I only gave you 1. The second reason is that it provides consistency, right? So in the same reason why you might use an int instead of a uint, or for that matter, uint 8 or whatever throughout your code, you generally, the best practice is to use a standard type for representing integers. It's kind of the same concept here. By using type erase publishers, it provides a standard expectation whenever we're working with publishers. Take that for what it's worth. I just find that this is a very clean way to both prevent being able to access any details about a publisher, and also provide for a standard expectation, and that we're always going to be working with a type erase publisher. So anyway, that's what we're doing there. So that takes care of our translation service. And now we can go back to our view model, continue on there, and that should actually work as advertised now. We still have some build issues that we need to resolve, but that should keep us going for now. And let's see. Okay, so in our send method, right now we have this message that is not taking into account the new translated value. So I'm going to just wrap this all to different lines to make it easier. So after the timestamp, we're now also going to have the language code, which will be an empty string. So this is the message that when you typed in the message, it's of course not translated yet. So we're just going to add empty strings for these. Translated value. Okay. And then we're going to add a method that actually does the translation for us, fetching the translation. So we'll add that, let's say, right before the insert, I think. Yeah. So we'll go scroll down here to right before the insert, and we'll add our fetch translation for message. To translation language code. And once again, this is going to return in any publisher. And this is going to be returning a message, but we're going to handle the error. So we're going to say never here. Okay, the first thing we want to do is we want to check to see if that message language code does not equal the translation language code, right? So if, for example, if you were to set your translation language to English and the message language is English, then there's no reason to make an API call because there's nothing to translate. That's why we're doing that, translation language code. Else, we're going to return. And so we have to return a publisher here. So we're going to return using this just constructor, which will wrap whatever you pass to it, either a value or a collection, and it'll create a publisher that emits just that thing, just that value or collection, that array, and then it'll finish. So that's what the just initializer does for us. So we're going to say, if there is the case that we are just passing the same values for both language code and translation language code, then we're going to just return the existing message erased to any publisher. And that's all we need to do there. Otherwise, we're going to return our translation service publisher for message, and we'll just pass through the message to the translation language code. Now we have a publisher. We're going to retry this once. So if there was a problem the first time, we'll retry it once, and that's all it takes to do that using Combine. We'll now use the decode, and we want to decode into our translation response. That's that intermediary DTO that we're using to reach in and get access to the actual translated value that we want. And we're going to use that decoder that I created the property for to just be a little more efficient, I guess. And compact map. And we'll reach into that object now, and we'll get the translations array.first. So if it was nil, then this compact map would filter that out, but otherwise we'll get the first value. And then we'll map, and we're going to access the translated value. Let's give it an argument name. And we'll convert this now, this translated value, into its own new message instance. And so that'll be, each of these values needs to be filled in, and we're going to basically pass through all the existing values, but then append essentially these new translated values. That's what we're doing there. So username is going to be message.username. Value message.value. Now that changes. Timestamp, same thing, message.timestamp. And now the language code will be a message.language code. The translation now will be the translation language code that got passed in, translation language code. And the translated value will be if the translated value is equal to the message value, we're going to provide an empty string. That's basically saying that this hasn't been translated, and that's why we're doing that. Otherwise, we're going to put the translated value. Okay. At the end of this, we have an error to deal with, and that's why we're not able to finish this off here yet. So we need to replace that error. This is just some very lightweight error handling. We're going to just replace it with the existing message. So all we're saying is if something went horribly awry with our translation, let's just go ahead and return a publisher of that message and call it a day. Again, this is a simplistic implementation just to demonstrate we're getting started with this stuff. So that's why I did it that way. And the last thing is erase to any publisher. And that way we match the return type that's required of this. Okay, we're getting close to being done with this. We're going to scroll down to the session. Oh, wait a second. Translation response.self. There we go. Okay, so we have this session, and we need to do a couple things differently here. So I'm going to just, inside of this session, did receive data. That's the one I want. So that's the second method that we implemented. We're going to we'll sort of refactor this on the fly. So the first thing we want to get the message is equal to try decoder that we now have an instance of decode message, message.self from data. And then we'll be clearing some of this out. We'll be replacing that here momentarily. So just work with me here. So let message, and then if is translating. Now, did I not create that? I think let's see. Yeah, I need to add that. I missed that up at the top here. So we're going to add a published property at the very top here, my published properties. Just put that right here. At published is translating. And that's going to be false. And we're going to be setting that from the SwiftUI view momentarily. So we'll come back down here now, and that's where we're going to use that is translating. Okay, let's see. If it's translating. So if we are translating, then we're going to go ahead and fetch that translation. So fetch translation for message to the translation language code. Now, when that happens, that's going to happen on the background thread. So we're going to want to receive on, and we'll use the dispatch queue.main to put this back on the main thread. So this would be the equivalent of dispatch queue.main.async, and then adding your code in the trailing closure of that method. This is how you do that in Combine, and this is putting us back on the main thread. And now we're going to use the other, we've used assign to a couple times. Now we're going to use the sync method, and we're just going to focus on receiving the value right now. We're not going to worry about receiving the completion event. So just receive the value, and in there, we're going to create a weak a weak capture of self. And we'll call self.insert message. And then we will, let's see, contextual type. Oh, then we will store this in the, let's see what's going on here. Fetch translation, receive on dispatch queue, sync, receive value.
Extra parentheses on 187.
Extra parentheses on 187. Is that right?
No, you actually need to define a local variable called message. So like weak self-messaging.
There you go. Yeah, this actually needs to stay because right. There we go. Thanks. And then store in subscriptions, right? So we've created a subscription. We need to make sure we store it. We're not going to be doing a separate insert there. So we're only doing that. Oh, actually, I take that back. Leave that there. Add the else block and just move it up. That's all we're doing. In case you didn't know the keyboard shortcut, Command, Option, and then the left and right brackets will move a line up or down, or any number of lines up or down. Kind of a neat little keyboard shortcut to know of. So now we are all set with that.
Hey, I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I was learning Combine, I didn't store the subscription in any like variable, and whenever I call the API, my like request got cancelled every time. So I was not storing it in somewhere. That's why is it getting cancelled?
Yes, when it goes out of when that if you for example were to say let subscription equal, sorry, let subscription equal, you would not have to store it in the subscription, but of course this is a local value and that's going to basically be released when it goes out of scope as well. So if you created a local property, right, so a regular instance property of your type, you could use that to manage that one individual subscription. But that means every subscription that you create, you'd want to save it to a local property so that you don't lose that subscription when you go out of scope. And just as important, you don't leak that memory, because if you create a subscription and then you don't do anything to cancel it, that stays in memory and you leak it, and so you'd have a problem there. So that's why I sort of recommend as a best practice to just add all your subscriptions to a subscriptions set. That way, when that set is about to go out of scope, so that keeps them from going away until you're ready for them to go away, until you were to, till this view model were to go out of scope, and then all of those will be canceled for you, the contents of that set. And there are exceptions to that. You might have a time when you have to create separate subscriptions so that you can empty some subscriptions. You want to cancel those requests and cancel those subscriptions under certain conditions. But in an example like this, we're just basically storing them all in the same subscription set.
Okay.
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 All right, so let's see here. Yep. We're going to keep going here, and we need to update our content view now. And we've got some changes to make there, and then I think we're going to be close to done. Let's see. So content view. And we're going to go down to the buttons. And so right now we just have disconnect if you were already connected. And what we want to do instead is we want to add a default, and the label will be based on, it'll be a text. It'll be based on if the view model is translating. And I'll just wrap this to the next line and make it a little easier to read. Is translating. Then we're going to say stop translating. Otherwise, start translating. I think I did to Spanish, but you can do whatever you like. Spanish. I'll just wrap that to the next line. And then the action for that button will be to self.viewModel.isTranslating toggle. And then this needs to just be a comma separation there. Okay. In the message view, I think that's all set for there. Let's just see. Should be able to build. I don't know if we're going to get any compile errors just yet. Expected var keyword and property declaration. Oh, yeah, that would help. Let's see. Great. Okay, so now in the message view, we have some changes to make. First, we need to add a binding. And this is going to bind that is translating that we receive from the parent view is translating. Now, we're going to need to actually display, Yandex requires you to display a link to their website if you do any translation, and it's supposed to be provided with every translation. So just to follow, their request or their requirement there, I'm going to do that. But in order for that to look nice in our implementation, we're going to add a couple of view modifiers here. This first one is going to be the multi-line text alignment, because it's going to wrap to multiple lines. And so we want the multi-line text alignment to be center. And this is going to be for that caption. And then on tap gesture, so after this foreground color view modifier, on tap gesture, we're going to say if self.isTranslating and message is translated, so it's already been translated, then we're going to say let URL equals URL with a string value. That's going to be http://translate.yandex.com. We're going to just force that because we know it's a good URL. And then we're going to call UI application.shared.open URL. Okay. Next, we're going to create a helper method here right above caption, and we're going to call it text for message, type message. And that'll be returning a string. And if we're translating and the message dot translated value is empty equals false. In other words, it's been translated, and message dot translated value. Otherwise, just pass the message value. And so now back up here in our text, we can change this to be the message value to self.text for message. We're also going to change our caption a little bit. So we go down to this caption, and we're going to start it out with an empty string. Then we're going to switch over a couple of things. We're going to switch over the message is from local user and is translating. And in the case where it is from the local user, we don't care whether or not it's translating, because we're not going to be translating our own message. And so we're just going to say caption equals message dot timestamp. Otherwise, if it is is translating, regardless whether it's is local user in that case, so true there, where the message dot is translated, then we will add to the caption or sorry, set the caption to, and this because I got a little tricky here with this, but to follow through it, what's happening here, we're going to do a line return, a carriage return, translation powered by yandex.translate. Again, this is their requirement, so we're just complying. It's their protocol. And then we're going to use a fall through control statement. And then in default, caption equals, and I think I can just copy and paste this. Let's see, message, yep, all of that. Is that right? Yeah, actually, I'm going to just type it out just to make sure. Caption equals message.username message.timestamp plus caption. So it's like the opposite of a plus equals, because I'm using this to append at the end And I just did that. I found this to be the fastest way to achieve it with the least amount of code. Let's see, I've got something missing here. Oh, then I need to return the caption. That's it. Okay, let's take a look. If that builds, now we have a failure here. Let's see, missing argument for parameter is translating call. There we go. So this is that ChatScrollView. We need to update that now. Oh, you know why? We also want to just get rid of this ChatScrollView altogether. We don't need this anymore because we're using the reversible ChatScrollView now. So we can just delete that out of our project. That takes care of that. I think we might have one other compiler error to deal with. Yep, and that's back here in this message view for the reversible scroll view. And that just needs to have the value added back that I took out before, which is is translating. And that'll be the self dot, and we're going to use the bind to the view model dot is translating. Okay, so we now have, I think, everything we need, and we will go ahead and run the app. We'll run it on a couple different devices here, or 3 different devices. How about that? The simulator. Let's see. Okay, and we'll run it one more, and we'll go ahead and launch on all 3 devices. We'll say that the iPhone 8 is the host. The iPhone 11 Pro is going to join that, and the iPhone Pro Max will join it as well. It'll start doing translation, start translating to Spanish, and we'll say, hey, what's going on? Send that, and voila. If you were to tap on that, it would take you to the website for Yandex. And if we tap on this, we can stop translating, and it switches back to English. Start translating, switches back to Spanish. And that's a wrap. Let's go back to the slides, finish things up, leave off with some Q&A, and let everybody get on with their days, nights, and evenings. Or days and evenings. Okay. All right. So quickly, we want to get everybody going here. I ran about 15 minutes late here. So you can download the final at this short link, GSCS final, the bit.ly short link. If you'd like more, and if you came to this on Wednesday, you know what's happening now. I'm telling you all about this book that I'm a co-author of, Combine Asynchronous Programming with Swift. The deep dive into all kinds of things in Combine that we didn't even touch upon today. And it also includes a good amount of SwiftUI. In fact, the final chapter is a Chuck Norris jokes app that I authored. I authored that final chapter, and it includes SwiftUI, Combine, unit tests, and core data. So you get it all. There is also a book, also part of the Ray Wenderlich library, called SwiftUI by Tutorials. It's a deep dive into SwiftUI. Lots of things we didn't cover today, but if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend these resources. Imagine that. All right, I've got a couple of questions for you. And we're going to do it like this. The other day I had everybody just verbally, because I couldn't see the chat. Then I figured out how to show the chat when I was sharing screen or doing a presentation. So now this time we're going to do this by way of the text in the chat. So hopefully everybody has that up and running. And the question is, what property wrapper lets you receive a bindable object from an ancestor? First person to type that in is Philip. Is that right? And it happens to be the correct answer. So Philip gets a copy of either Combine or the SwiftUI book. Philip, just send me a message and let me know which one you'd prefer and give me your email address, and I will make sure that happens. Okay, I've got one other question for you. What property wrapper lets you connect an @state property to a child viewer?
Bindable.
Binding.
Oh, who did it?
Oh,
Who did it first? Peter. That was close. That was very close. Oh, Michael, you're so close. And Amit, you were close too. Sorry, I only have 2 books to give away, but I hope that this was helpful. And if you have any other questions for me, I've got about 5 minutes that I can stick around for, and then I have another meeting I need to run to. So first, I definitely want to thank everyone for being a part of this today. I hope this was helpful. We covered a lot of ground. And this was, again, supposed to be a live workshop. And I thought I didn't want to throw away this effort, and the content would be stale by the time the App Dev conference does happen, which is, I guess it's going to be late in September. So I hope this was helpful and it was worthwhile use of your time. Would take any feedback, good, positive, negative, criticism, whatever. Feel free to do so. But I'll leave it open for some questions before we wrap up.
Are there
going for Peter, if you want to give me your email so I can send you that. Go ahead.
Yeah, this workshop gonna continue? There's gonna another workshop on SwiftUI and Combine?
Yeah, I'd like to do more. I really would. I will say that this was a good amount of time and effort to put into this. So if you have an interest to see more of these and you'd like to support my work, I did provide the ID for my Cash or PayPal. But as much as I can with time permitting, I'd like to do more of these. I really enjoy covering these types of things, and I'd like to go deeper into maybe more complex implementations. And I think somebody had made the comment earlier about there being an opportunity to further decouple things, and I agree. So that would maybe be a nice workshop to go into a more elaborate implementation. Maybe I spread it out over a period of days or something like that, and dive deeper into more complex implementations, because I think that's what people are going to start to be thirsty for, right, after you get past the sort of getting started phase of SwiftUI and Combine. So yeah, I'd definitely like to do more.
Okay, we are looking forward to it.
Okay. Any other questions?
Can I get that book?
Can you get the book? Well, if that's Peter or Philip, then yes. If it's not, then sorry, I only have 2 to give away. They are fairly specific about how many books we can give away for each event, whatever. And I ended up requesting 1 for each for this and 1 for each for the other session. But if I have another session, maybe there's an opportunity to give away more books.
Peter and I both gave it up to Amit, so I don't know. You can read the chat.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, well, if you guys worked it out between yourselves, whoever wants to get it, just put it in the chat. I'll see the chat after the session ends, and I can follow up with you on that. Basically, it'll be a PDF copy of the book, and I'll just have the link sent out to you to download it.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, you bet.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you handle something like collection views in SwiftUI? I mean, have you tried wrapping an actual collection view in view representable? And do you know if there's any performance hits from doing such things, or do you prefer doing vstacks or hstacks and scroll views and stuff like that?
Well, that's a 2-part question. My preference is to use native SwiftUI as much as possible and not resort to using UI hosting view controller, or sorry, UI view controller representable or UI view representable as much as possible. So I think it depends on what your needs are. So if your needs go beyond the basic ability to do vertical or horizontally scrolling lists, essentially, then you have no choice. But without maybe some really complex implementation, to go ahead and just wrap the UI collection view and go that route. An example of that I found is that, for example, if you want the collection view to be able to snap to center, or the center of each item as you're scrolling, through that collection view, then that might be something where I'm not sure that it would be worth the effort to try to make that happen in SwiftUI using preference keys and all that. I haven't noticed any kind of performance hits in wrapping any kind of view controllers, or for that matter, views. It seems to be pretty clean, and like I said, SwiftUI itself is much, much faster than UIKit. You get the benefit of most of the SwiftUI rendering happening in Metal, so you get that for free. And I found that it's very, very fast, and so no, I haven't seen any performance hits on wrapping UIKit components in a SwiftUI view.
One more question related to collection in SwiftUI. So in UIKit, we have DQ reusable. So every time it requires to load data in a particular cell, like loading an image, it calls it as it needs. But when we implement this in SwiftUI using vstack and hstack with ScrollView, every view is created at an instant. So that all the APIs will be hidden at a time. Like I have 15 cells, so 15 requests will be hidden at instant. So do we have any methods to like performant that.
So what's actually happening is this is a sort of a top-down declarative thing going on. Whenever an observable state changes that a SwiftUI view is observing, it causes that body property to be called, and everything in it is redrawn for exactly the state of that view that needs to be displayed to the user. And so inside of that scroll view, inside of that VStack, we had the for each initializer that takes a collection and it vends just the right amount of cells on demand. So as you're scrolling, the internals of SwiftUI, this is that aspect of declarative that really, you know, takes a moment to kind of really get a handle on. That aspect of declarative UI is I'm saying I want views to be vended on demand for the for each constructor that I'm using here. When do those get queued and dequeued and, you know, and all of that is beyond my worry. That's an imperative concern that goes away with SwiftUI. But it does do the right thing. It does vend those views on demand, and it handles the memory or the queuing, dequeuing, and whatnot for each of those views that's being displayed for it for you. So you don't have to worry about trying to, you know, use the DQ type APIs that you would with a UI kit and more imperative approach.
Okay.
Yep. It's a great question. Okay, I actually do have to run, everyone. I'm not going away, so if you do have more questions, feel free to ask them on Twitter, or I think LinkedIn. You could ask comments as well. I will be downloading this recording, doing some very minor editing to it, and then I'll upload it along with the slides, and I'll post the final project on GitHub, and I'll include all that in my social media, Twitter and LinkedIn. So I really hope this was helpful to everyone. Hope you are excited as I am to be using SwiftUI and Combine in production here soon enough. And like I said, if you have any questions, reach out. Hope I get a chance to talk to all of you at some point. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Great presentation. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thanks a lot.